Welcome to the GreatBase Tennis Podcast, episode 92. I'm Steve Smith, along with Roberto Calla, the Peruvian, our Pele, Messi. Roberto and I spent 15 years together in the trenches teaching tennis. We're in Boynton Beach, Florida. We're at the FM Tennis Performance Center. Our guest tonight, let me just keep you in a little bit of suspense. Roberto knows our guest quite well. We coached him when he was a kid. But I want to mention another podcast, Control the Controllables. I'm very fortunate that on a regular basis, people send me all sorts of content. And I read where Control the Controllables is a number one, or was one poll voted the number one tennis podcast in 2021. It's excellent. I've listened to several episodes. Daniel Kiernan, he obviously has a lot of people behind the scenes helping him. Why I mentioned that is he has an interesting formula. At the end of the podcast, he asks his guests who they would like to interview. And then he asks them to carry the baton and help them make arrangements so they can interview the person that was recommended. Actually, Daniel, I listened to one podcast. He definitely remembers being at the Seguso Bassett Tennis Academy. Dave Anderson, who we've had on, he was with me at the time. We coached a group of kids. Angela Buxton brought over from the late Angela Buxton, former Wimbledon champion, brought over from Great Britain. The Rover, is it Range Rover? Yeah, the British car company sponsored it. Seguso Bassett's now Chris Everts, but Daniel was there. He was one of the young kids that we coached for, I believe it was 5 weeks. But again, hats off to Control the Controllables and the idea they have to interview the greatest minds in tennis. And he does mention how, from every walk of tennis. But so tonight we're interviewing someone I would say right now he's not a player. As we get going, you'll find out that he has some impressive credentials, but he's not a player. He's not a coach. He is a parent. Along with his wife, their young son, Blaze, what a great name. That I wouldn't say that he's, because his child's so young, is that he's not an active tennis parent. But he has a story, and I think that I've had many interesting conversations with him about his thoughts with tennis. But let me say this with Roberto. We'll get to our guest here shortly. We're doing this during the NHL playoffs. That's the love of the game. That would be like, I'm going to ask you a tough question, Roberto. Would you want to do a podcast when the World Cup is on? That's a yes or no answer to start with. I've heard you say no to quite a few people. Roberto and I, he's the good cop, I'm the bad cop. Nadal, he was at the World Cup, and it was in South Africa. It was right after he won Wimbledon, and he said he wasn't going to go. But the family, they eventually chartered a plane, which is obviously quite expensive. And he's such a classy act. So he's in the locker room when Spain won the World Cup in South Africa. And the person interviewing him said, "Isn't it just like Wimbledon?" And he said, "Well, in all fairness to Wimbledon, nothing is as big as the World Cup." But tell us why, Roberto. We're going to get to our guest here. And I remember having you challenging him with soccer, like you do with all our players. Why do you think that Messi is the greatest soccer player of all time?
You know that many experts or people all around the world compare with Maradona. I think Maradona was fantastic. Unfortunately, he has some issues outside soccer that affect his record, his performance. I think Messi is the best in the history of the game because every week, the that you can enjoy him playing, just seeing him playing it.
I think one thing for anybody who's coaching any athlete needs to show the clip of him, and there's several of him playing soccer when he was 8 years old.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing. We're going to interview Alex Vuckovic. We're going to get him on the phone. We're going to tell you that, again, coming back to all sports, I think, again, his story. Let's get going with this. See if I can use my phone here. But I remember you, I said, okay, let's have a competition and have soccer be part of it. Now, if I could get my phone here to work.
Hey, Steve.
Alex Vuckovic, along with,
yes, sir.
I'm here with someone that you spent years with, Roberto Calla. And
hey, Roberto.
Alex, glad to hear you again.
With I was just telling our listeners as we opened up that you certainly played some soccer with us, but the years you spent with us were all about tennis. With I was talking about Control the Controllables, where they do interview I would say a lot of famous people in tennis because of their format. They ask a famous person, who would you recommend to interview, and it's who you hang out with. We spent years out hanging out with you, so we would say right now, okay, no current title. I'd give you the title right now of hobby coach, which I think is important. Years and years ago, that's what people did. They weren't paid. They coached. They had a proper job, as it was called, and they just taught for love of the game. But you're currently working outside of tennis, former student. There's a lot of claims to fame. You can tell people you turned Harvard down. Went to the school where Batman played tennis. Went to Princeton, played at Princeton. But no, your passion, your love of the game. I think we can get around to talking about your story, but how it ties in with perhaps information, no information, levels of understanding, ego, maturity, outside influences. And I think everybody, whether they're a coach, whether they're a parent, player. But let's start with, we do this with most people in tennis. Let's start with your connection to tennis, your beginning days in tennis. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. And, if you don't mind, before I even dive into, how I started out in tennis, I just wanted to just say real quick, with what you're doing with the GreatBase, right, with this podcast and with the online courses that you've set up, I think it's a really good thing for American tennis. And, for any American junior that's out there that's got aspirations to play tennis at the highest levels, at the world-class level, if you're listening to this, you've stumbled across some valuable information, and you'd be well served to dig into this deeper. And I would just say, Steve, in terms of the utility of the information that you're putting out, it's, in my opinion, it's unrivaled today in tennis teaching. So I think, all that you're doing there to put this information out is such a great thing for tennis in general and for American tennis as well. So wanted to make sure I said that. But getting to my story, I remember, so my father was kind of a recreational tennis player. So he loved to play tennis. It was a hobby of his. And, my father was in the military for a couple of decades, and he actually deployed. He went on a deployment to Bosnia in the early 90s when obviously that wasn't a very good time to be in Bosnia. But, before he left, he bought me a racket. And I just remember, swinging that racket around a lot. That was kind of my very, very first intro to tennis, was just seeing this racket and swinging it around a lot. I must have been in, I don't know, third or fourth grade or something like that. And then we, when he got back a year later, we all went to West Africa in Senegal, Dakar, and there was a tennis club there where there were a couple of Senegalese tennis players that were giving lessons. I mean, lessons were very affordable. There it was like $1 an hour or something crazy like that. So I first started taking lessons there maybe once a week, just on the weekends, and then also playing a lot with my dad. So I was maybe 9, 10, 11 years old or so, playing him every weekend. And, I don't think there was a single weekend where I had won a game. I think he won every single time that entire year. And I just remember being so upset every time. I was so competitive, even at that young age. But that was definitely my intro to tennis. And then, after that, we had moved to Florida, and I kind of, we kind of stayed there from middle school all through high school, because at that time I was getting older, and the military kind of works with families for stability once kids get to like kind of a high school age where they don't move you around so much. So I was able to kind of finish out my middle school and high school years in one spot in the Tampa area, and that's when you really, started to take lessons a couple times a week, started to really play full time, I would say, when I was maybe 12 or 13. And that was around the time, Steve, that a couple of your students, beat up on me pretty good at some of the local tournaments, and how I initially got connected to you and started training with you pretty much for the majority of my time up until high school and then going into college. So, yeah, so that was it.
You say we, Father Chuck, Mother Young, Brother James.
Yeah.
How many years between you and James?
2.5.
2.5. International family. Mother's Korean. Your father, Chuck, how many languages does he speak?
Oh, at least 3. English. He speaks English, French, and then also he speaks Serbian. So he's pretty fluent in Serbian as well.
Yeah. West Point grad. He was a boxer, right? When he was at West Point?
He was. Yeah, he did some boxing at West Point. I think he won. He's about a 500 boxer. I hear he's got a pretty good chin. He can take a hit.
That's good. Good. The influence of boxers. I think of Jimmy Connor's uncle, Andre Agassi's father. A lot of people have taken boxing lessons. Did you do any of that with your dad? Did he teach you how to box?
No, I never did any boxing. No, I can't say that I did.
So born in Germany, right?
Yep.
And then I remember you played a young Russian boy, not to mention his name, but he was lying his age. He would have won.
Right.
He would have easily won the 12s. We found out that he was 14, and someone was sponsoring him, and but yeah, he played you. I remember my son Mikhail. He's in '89. You're in '86, right?
Yep, 86.
Yeah. So your mother, I for the most part, other than video work, I for years and years didn't give private lessons. I mean, I remember at one point that's all I did, but you also lived quite a ways from, Tampa's a big city. You lived out in Brandon. You have a long car ride to where we were teaching. But I remember you improved, but then my memory of that is, and that's what we need to talk about with the GreatBase. We're going a little bit too slow, and going back. I mean, I talked to tennis parents right before this. I had back-to-back meetings with tennis parents. I just remember so many conversations, more so with your mom because your dad was in and out. But you left at one period, and then I think it was in the recruiting process where Michigan. I'm going to guess. So, first of all, the Ivies. You went to Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and then Rice and Michigan to be on a recruiting trip.
Yep.
And somewhere along the line that you came back. So you were working with us, and then you weren't. But let's go through junior tennis. You were ranked as high as number 2 in Florida in the 18s, I remember. But
Yep.
you didn't play. I mean, because academics was number one. You were a regular schooler. You didn't play that many national tournaments, correct?
I didn't play that many. I really started playing more national tournaments when I was in the 16s and 18s. So I played a few of the super nationals. I played the one out in Arizona during the winter a couple times, and then I did play Kalamazoo once, and I played the clay courts once, and that was, I think, the summer of my junior year or the summer of my sophomore year, one of those. Where I played those tournaments, but mostly, stayed local and played a lot of the Florida designated and the state closed every year.
I remember when you played Kalamazoo, you played Donald Young. And
I did, yeah.
Donald Young is an 89, you're an 86, so he's, obviously much younger than you. But Raven Clausen, he started training with us when he was 18. And he didn't go to college. So we do it with everybody. We put more of an emphasis on Raven to be able to teach tennis. But so I was in the room, and we had the film of the match, and Raven made a film off the film. You have any recollection of that?
I do. I remember sitting in that back room with Raven, going over the film. And I just remember Raven being so unimpressed with Donald Young's game. And no offense to Donald Young, he got the top 50, I think, in the world in singles, and played at a higher level than most people get to. But I don't remember the details of what we went over. I just remember thinking, wow, Raven, he's not super impressed with Donald's game, and that was a little frustrating to me because he'd kind of beat me pretty convincingly. So it made me realize that there was a lot of work to be done.
I remember one thing with that, though, that Raven was amazed with Donald Young's walk. I mean, how he carried himself and just the confidence he had. And Raven used to say, dude, he goes, I need to take some lessons on confidence from this dude. But I think when we get down to some issues, I get through some information on your background. But typically we're not impressed. We watch someone play, certainly impressed on one side, but then on the other, people have holes in their game. You were number 2 in Florida, and we certainly are not patting ourselves on the back going, this is awesome. This guy is great. And, this past weekend, had a dad, actually a mom and a dad here with their 2 daughters, and the young gal, she was taught from the get-go by one of our former guests on the podcast, Cole Reeves. Alanis Hamilton is a 14-year-old qualifier. She gets to the finals at ITF. It's ITF 4. And, then she comes in the video room, and we look at some film, and we're not trying to hurt anybody's feelings. There is no positives, no negative, but the dad did say, with Andy Fitzell, who really founded our podcast and is so knowledgeable. So Russ said, "Well, Steve, you and Andy come across like know-it-alls." That's what he thought. That's what he thought at first, and he said, "But now, the more I've gone through this," he said, "I was at a place where there was and this is very common in Florida. There's all these 3-wall racquetball courts." There's it seems like there's a sea of kids hitting tennis balls. I think of being at the Biltmore for 12 and unders, and you can sit in Miami and just watch these kids hit the backboard, and it's like, oh no. But once you have, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, when you talk about not being impressed, right? That resonates with me because I remember one time, I was, you were on the court, we were at HCC in Tampa, and I'd asked you a question about James Blake's backhand, versus Federer's backhand. And I asked you, I said, hey, Blake takes his backhand low first, and then Federer kind of takes it high, where it just stays high, low, high versus low, high, right? And I asked you, what's the difference? Does it matter? And then, that's where you told me about what's called a reset backswing. where it goes a reset backswing, for people that don't know, is where you take the racket back low, then it goes high, then it goes back low, and then back high again, which is 4 parts. Versus like if you watch a Federer or Wawrinka, right, when they turn, the racket's up high and it just goes high, low, high, which is 3 parts. And so when you explain to me, would you rather have a 4-part swing or a 3-part swing? To me, it just makes too much sense to have a 3-part swing because it's more efficient. You can play the ball earlier. You can handle forcing shots better. But, to be able to look at somebody like a James Blake who played at an extremely high level, or to look at like a Leighton Hewitt, right, that's got a reset on the backhand, multiple Grand Slam winner, former number 1 in the world, and to be able to be critical and say, hey, this part of that person's game is inefficient, I guess maybe, that would come, not everybody would receive that well. But I just think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is, they don't compare the player to their potential. So, Hewitt was great in so many ways, but instead of winning 2 slams, could he maybe have won 6 slams if he didn't have that reset on the backhand? Or could Agassi have won 20 slams if he could play from the service line in? Right. So, I think that's, and for players that are out there today, I think that's really the approach that they want to take as they're looking to develop their game is, compare themselves to their potential and to think about it that way.
Oh, that's well put. I think with our course Tennis Intelligence Applied, this goes way back before I met Roberto. It was in the early 90s in Boca Raton at the Seguso Bassett Tennis Academy. And Karina Murari, I used to just chart matches for her. And I know that, I believe she ended up being 28 in the world. But she won a Wimbledon doubles title with Lindsay Davenport. We talk about doubles, where I mentioned that Davenport says they don't even let me talk about doubles in my family. Not to digress, she married into the Leach family. But yeah, I remember telling her father, Albin, a neurosurgeon, I go, just let me show you some film. We're going through the stats. I said, no, the coach doesn't need to see it. The player doesn't see it. Let me just show you the film. Hewitt, you got to take your hat off to Hewitt. I mean, I remember a coach telling a group of players, you can wish to be Federer, you can wish to be Sampras, but one person you can copy is Hewitt, not from a technical standpoint, but just such true grit. Coming back to backhands, it's like even Federer. I mean, I think you have to listen to the players. And Federer had the 3 wishes, and one was, someone said if he had 3 wishes, the first one was that Nadal would have become a soccer player. So
and that he had Wawrinka's backhand.
Yeah, right. The smart enough to say third wish I would save, and because he's got play at the bottom of the swing, and there's not a perfect way to hit a tennis ball. But I think also it's really, that's just a sign of the times, more so now than ever, that people are always talking about the pros. I mean, somebody hasn't coached tennis for 5 years, 10 years, and they're talking to the parents. Well, this is how Federer hits it. This is how Nadal hits it, and it's like, really. But with your junior background, homeschool versus traditional school, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, obviously, you didn't have a choice. I mean, but when you trained with us, some of the kids were, by that time, homeschooling.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I was a public school product. It was not a very, challenging experience, I would say. It wasn't a ton of homework or anything until you got into, maybe some of the AP classes. You'd have to do a little bit more studying to make sure, you did well on the end of the year exams. But, in some ways, I think the public school system, it really depends on what area of the country you are. Different areas have stronger curriculums and stronger public schools. I think that there is a significant advantage to being homeschooled. I don't think it necessarily has to result in lower quality education. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think it can even be, better quality education. Homeschooling can be. I think the one thing that maybe you miss out on is the social aspect, right, of going to a public school and interacting with a bunch of other kids and some of the personal development and growth that comes from those social interactions. But you could certainly find other ways to have that, even if you're homeschooled. But for somebody that is, very serious about playing tennis at a world-class level, I would think that the advantages of homeschooling would be, those would be significant just in terms of the flexibility and the time it affords you.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, you also started late, 12 years old. What would you say to many kids that they didn't decide yet what sport to take around 10, 12, 13?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I think it's a great idea to play lots of different sports as a kid. I think, you're going to develop, different muscles, hand-eye coordination, things like that. You'll just get a more comprehensive understanding and mastery over your body by being exposed to a lot of different sports. And, I would say, when it comes down to selecting a sport, right, I think it's got to be a mix of a little bit of logic and a little bit of heart, right? Like what sport do you enjoy the most? But if I'm 4'8" and I can't jump a lick, but basketball I love, might just not be realistic. So I think it's a combination of, thinking logically about it, but then also, going with, with your heart and what you like and what you enjoy the most. But I like the idea of playing a lot of different sports and getting a feel for it. So, for me, I think, why I ended up selecting tennis, in some ways, the two sports that I really enjoyed were basketball and tennis. And, my dad had always told me that I had a better shot at making it as a basketball player. And I think that's what really drove me the tennis route at the end of the day. It was like, oh, really? Okay, well, I'll show him. And then I just, at that point, around 13 or 14, went all in on the tennis side, but love it, and don't have any regrets and love that I made that decision. And to this day, I would consider myself a huge tennis fan, a lover of tennis, a continued student of the game, and still try to find time to get out there and help kids that want to get better and also work on my own game, at least a few times a week, despite, working this career focused job that I work and also being a husband and a father and all that.
What sports did you play in Africa? What years were you there?
So I was in Cameroon for a couple of years when I was very young, maybe second and third grade. And then I was in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal for 2.5 years up until sixth grade. And I played a lot of soccer growing up in Dakar. So I went to this school. It was an international school, the International School of Dakar. I went there for my first year. And that was, you would be in a classroom of 12 students from 12 different countries, right? Like from Egypt and Belgium and Italy. It'd be like all the sons and daughters of diplomats and, defense attaches and things like that. So my first year I kind of spent there, and every Saturday morning, the international school, like we'd have a group of guys that were some of the better athletes and we'd play soccer together, and we'd always coordinate a soccer match, every 10 a.m. with some of the local Senegalese kids. And it was just this huge thing. Like every Saturday morning we'd go out to like this green field at the international school, which was like, for those Senegalese kids, it was like they were used to playing on like dirt roads with rocks and things like that. So for them to have this beautiful like field of grass, it was like they loved playing there every Saturday. And I remember for a year straight, every Saturday, I think we lost every single game except once. I think we tied them. But so I played a whole bunch of soccer growing up. when I was in West Africa in Dakar. So I think in a lot of ways that served me well in my tennis game.
When I hear Cameroon, I think of that's where Arthur Ashe discovered Yannick Noah. He was there helping the ITF with clinics for underprivileged children.
Yep.
Roberto, that's got to hit you at home by hearing a story about people playing soccer in the streets, playing in the dirt.
Yeah. Alex, I think you saying that playing other sports actually helped you with your movement and with the athlete you became.
Yes, I would agree with that. And even with that, I remember my dad. I've got to give him some props on this, but he would always, when I was younger, he'd always take me out to the playground, right? And he'd always do these, hey, I'll give you a quarter, if you can walk backwards on this balance beam without falling down, or I'll give you a quarter if you can hang on to these bars for 60 seconds, and he just put me through all these tests all the time on the weekends when I was younger. And in some ways, I think that combined with all the different sports that I played, helped me be coordinated and maybe help develop some athleticism. Because I think I'm not trying to brag or anything, but when I look, around my father, my mother, neither of them are particularly athletic, So, and in some ways, I think you can develop that, as a kid, depending on the types of things that you do, whether it's enroll your kid in something like gymnastics at a very young age, or you're just getting them involved in lots of different sports. I think to a certain extent, genetics is involved, but I think to a large extent, there are things you can do to develop athleticism, when your kids are younger.
I'll tell you a story. I've got some names here. I tell people I remember who I trained, but I don't remember who was with who. And that's with tennis teachers, tennis players. But I have some of these names down that trained when you trained with us. And again, some of them were with us 24/7 because we housed them. But you were commuting from a good distance away, so it wasn't like you were there nearly as much as some of these people. But I mean, I could even go like Ryler DeHart was a day student, but Ryler DeHart, Illinois. Taki Marita Rice, Rye Tarpley Northwestern, Ryan Fleming Clemson, Raven Clausen. He didn't pursue college tennis, but he's played at the professional level. He's been on center court Wimbledon fifth set playing doubles. I know Roberto, when he hears that story, he goes, yes, and he used to run our dollar clinic. Megan Broderick went to Kentucky. Liberty Svecki went to Vanderbilt. And Ryler DeHart was obviously in Florida. Very, very good. I mean, he's very good, period. I know at one time he ended up being ranked 1 in the rankings. He was, I think, number 3 might have been his high, but the year they changed the birthday where it rolled over to you could play so he's born in March, I believe. So, that very first part of the January, February of the next year, he was ranked 1 in the country. But I can remember I said, okay, trying to just teach you how important it is to one, know that you were very athletic and have the inner belief system, but that you needed to really focus on technique. I said, all right, we're going to have a contest with you and Ryler. So he's an 84, you're an 86. He's older, and it was this is where Roberto I had to have him break out of being the bad cop. So you played basketball, and you were good enough to school him in basketball. I mean, he's a very, very competitive guy, so he'd probably go, I'd like to see the film. I don't think I was schooled. But you had played basketball, and he's a gamer. He loves so. But he definitely was going to win tennis, so it was good. So then you played soccer and put you on the opposite teams. And before you played, I said Roberto's going to judge who's the better soccer player. And then afterwards, I said, all right, over here, Roberto. And I said, who's the better soccer player? Roberto goes, it was a tie. I go, no, it's one or the other. And so Roberto gave you the vote, and but I was just trying, I think tennis coaches have to stand on their head. One of the reasons we make these videotapes are very verbose is we're unfortunately trying to persuade people that they need to work on technique. But there was quite a few tennis players. I do think we get around to talking to parents through this podcast is when you rank 2 in Florida, even though you're surrounded by tennis players that are older and they're trying to play pro tennis. I think that many times you just get caught up in, well, I'm number 2 in Florida.
Absolutely.
And ego comes into it. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I would say, gosh, Steve, there's so many thoughts that come to mind when you talk about the ego. Yeah, I had a lot of success, relatively speaking, being number 2 in Florida in the 18s and winning a couple national titles. And, but I would say that, what I didn't see was that I was limiting my ceiling, right? So we talked about comparing yourself to your potential. And, I never achieved my full potential, I would say, during my, during those junior and college years. And, if I had to attribute it to one thing, it would be ego. Because, you're 2 in Florida and you don't necessarily see all the time the need to make those changes. And you don't want to take steps backwards. You don't want to go from beating somebody to now losing to somebody. It goes back to those days as a kid playing my dad in Senegal and crying every single time I lost. I didn't want to lose. I never wanted to lose. And at the end of the day, sometimes what's best for you is to not care whether you win or lose. It's to not care where the ball is about to go when you hit it, because you have to be okay with totally breaching this comfort zone and just swinging away that's totally foreign to you with a totally different grip than you've hit with your entire life, and just be okay with where that ball goes. And that didn't really start happening for me until I started teaching tennis after college, where it wasn't about really winning anymore for me. I was done pretty much, playing competitively. And it was more, I was just trying to help these other kids that had the same aspirations that I did growing up, which was to play world-class tennis. And, when I first started teaching, players like, Robin Anderson and some others, I was trying to think, what do I tell this person, And I naturally resorted to the information that you had taught to me for so many years growing up. And I just never really thought about it as critically until I started actually teaching it. And like people say, teaching is the ultimate form of retention. And that was a big thing for me, where I was teaching these players to move the racket a certain way, to understand the interrelationship between your technique and your tactics, and how you can't play the proper tactics without the proper technique. And as I was doing that, I was then working on my own game, because I could no longer stand, hitting the ball in ways that I knew were inefficient. I had to, at that point, start correcting it on my own. And that's when, if you were to watch me hit the ball today versus how I hit the ball my senior year of college, where I didn't have a terrible career. I finished my career playing number 1 and number 2 singles for Princeton. But the way I swing the racket today is vastly different and vastly more efficient than it was 10, 12 years ago.
With that, with college, for our listeners, Alex, you went to Princeton, and not unlike most Princeton grads, and I know everything has a set of circumstances. Your parents, they were not based in Florida at that time. They were based in England. Correct me if I'm wrong. So there were several summers when you were at Princeton, if not all of them, where you taught for us in Tampa. But yeah, let's.
That's right, Steve. All my peers were taking internships at J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs, and I was still going down in the summers to play tennis, because that's what I love to do. So I figured, hey, go down there and try to work on my game and help some of the kids around that were still there in Tampa. So.
Well, when you worked with us, so I mentioned, these are pretty impressive schools: Illinois, Rice, Northwestern, Clemson, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, and there was others. But even though, say, for example, you're 2 in the 18s, you're coming out training with us, there was some kids that were several years younger than you that we would say had better skills. They were,
Oh, yeah.
for our listeners, Alex is a lefty, he's long and lean, athletic, but that's a measurement for us is how well we feed you 25 shots at designated targets and you only get 10 in.
Yeah.
You're at 40%. So that's where many times for our listeners, brawn plays brain. The brawn is a 16-year-old boy playing against a 12-year-old boy, and the 12-year-old boy is actually a better tennis player, but the 16-year-old boy wins. Coming back to winning's not confusing.
That's right.
It's totally confusing. But we'll talk a little bit about Princeton, but Roberto, I see he's taking some notes over here. Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, I want to take advantage about what you said in your junior years, that you are afraid to lose. What advice you will give it to the kids that they are competing now? They're going to, now it's even getting worse with the UTR, that is a number, and the kids are playing afraid to lose. They what advice you'll give a kid if they'll tell you, Alex, I'm nervous? What advice you'll give it to them?
Roberto, man, you got some good questions. No, that's a great question. I got so many thoughts on that. So I'll just start with a couple of things that initially come to mind. One, let's talk about, the concept of crying over spilt milk, right? So it's what you call a sunk cost. It's one of those things I learned in a Princeton economics class, which I think I got a C+ in. So
what's the concept again? What's the name of the concept?
Just the concept of don't cry over spilt milk. Yeah. It's what you would call a sunk cost. So it's where, you double fault and you're upset about it, or you just lost that point. You're upset about it. It's over. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't unspill the milk, right? So, one of the things is to understand that concept and to think about what you can do now and moving forward, and not to dwell on the past, not to, Steve, as you used to say, take those 25 seconds or whatever you have to self-destruct, right? Be a thinker, don't be a feeler, that type of thing. So, that's one thought that comes to mind. Another thought is, in terms of being scared, I think predetermined targets. So, predetermined targets are, Steve, you've got the 7 concepts of single strategy, but in a lot of ways, I think understanding the dimensions of the court, understanding, for example, what the short ball range is, right? Where if you can, you'd rather approach cross court versus down the line so that your opponent has to deal with the angle of deflection if they're trying to pass you up the line. But understanding the math and the geometry of the court, I think, helps with things like pressure because it's going to help you understand what's high percentage versus what's low percentage. And you can take comfort in the fact that that you're playing a sound strategy. And that in and of itself allows you to just place full faith in that and to go for that shot that is the correct shot to go for. Another thing that comes to mind is confidence. And, where does confidence come from? Confidence comes from skills, right? And skills come from, confidence comes from winning. Winning comes from skills, and skills come from practice and know-how. And one other thing that I'll say is that you take it not even 1 point at a time. Sometimes you take it one shot at a time. So like if you're down break point and it's 5-all in the third and you're down 30-40 and, you're not even thinking, let me win this point. If you miss the last 2 first serves in the net, maybe all you're thinking about right now is I'm about to serve this ball out wide. And if you're a left-handed player like me, I'm going to keep my right side up as long as possible. I'm not going to let this right side drop. I'm just going to stretch this right side out so that I can hit this serve and clear the net. Sometimes you break it down to that level. to not get too far ahead of yourself. So I know that was kind of a collection of random thoughts there in terms of not playing scared. But I think, those are all very relevant, important things to think about when we talk about that.
Roberto, just today, Roberto told this girl, Anastasia, and it's a privilege for Roberto and I to be working with her. And Roberto told me that he had told her that you'll always be nervous and just welcome nervousness as your friend. It's going to be there.
Pressure's a privilege, and breathing helps.
No, great advice, Alex. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And you agree now that this UTR it's actually doesn't help when you're trying to develop players. They're too much focused about winning and know about the process and be more focused about improving your game and become a better player.
Yeah, the UTR. I'm not even that familiar with it because I don't think it was even around when I was playing. So I can't really speak on, whether it's been good for the game or bad for the game. But all I know is that, for somebody that really wants to play world-class tennis, in a lot of ways, you've got to be mature beyond your years, right? And sometimes that includes being more mature than your parents. And, keeping the long term in mind, that's one thing I'd really like to get certain juniors to understand, that it's one thing if maybe your goal is to go play D1 tennis and you're fine with just doing that and never playing world-class tennis. But for those that truly want to go and win slams someday, if you're 15 or 16, what you've got to realize is you've got 20 more years to work on your game. You've got 2 more decades. And I think most 15 or 16-year-olds are thinking, I got 12 to 24 months, to get to where I need to be, which is just such a short-sighted way to look at it. And that's where I think, caring about what your UTR is when you're 17 or 18, that just really doesn't matter, for those that want to play world-class tennis. Might be different for, somebody that maybe that's financially struggling, that needs to get a scholarship to a D1 school. I could see how that would be different, but for the most part, I would advise juniors to think, when I'm 15, 16, I got another frickin' 2 decades to work on this thing, and I think that helps you do the things that are required to give you the best shot to attain your goals.
I know so many people. I think it's almost 100% of people who played college tennis, they was the greatest years of their life. But if someone wants to, they can go to junior college. They can go to college remotely and just work on their game and play these UTRs. There's a lot of upside with UTR. I think that the downside is what people make of it. There's certainly the downside that the entry fees there's no rules and regulations. It's the wild, wild west, where the USTA tournaments, the USTA has regulations on how much you can charge. But, the backdraw, they're playing 4 games and no ads. So not to get into all that, parents are paying more money and playing less tennis. But it's really the interpretation. And I like what you said about, you got 2 more decades. Vic Braden used to tell, 15-year-olds, you got 75 years to work on your games for the 90 and overs.
Yeah.
I told Roberto we're going to have a chat with you tonight, and I said, "You remember that dumb kid named Vuckovic?" And he said, "Yeah." And I said, when we first met him, Roberto, I said he couldn't spell cat unless I spotted in the C and the T, and Roberto said, "No, Steve, I had to tell him the middle letter was A."
Well, yeah. It's funny, Steve, when people ask me about Princeton, they automatically assume that I'm, some kind of genius. And I always try to tell them that it was just that I had a world-class serve.
There you go.
I like that, Alex.
The serve helped. Your tennis certainly helped. That's where if you're number 2 in the 18s, your SAT score can be a little bit lower and your GPA can be a little bit lower.
That's right. So certainly, it would have been very difficult, to get in without these tennis angles, for sure.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, I have one more question about tournaments. In all your years as a junior, and now we talk about tournaments and the fees and now tournaments with no ads in 10-point tiebreak as a third set. I always try to help young players and players that are playing tournaments. With your experience, you as accomplished player, what advice you would give it to a junior? They're gonna play how to play a tiebreak, 10 points.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised, that they got rid of like a full third set. I mean, that to me is pretty wild. Not sure what the thinking is there, but the 10-point tiebreaker, I don't know that you would really approach it any differently. I think, you play every point kind of independently, and you would generally want to use the 7 basic principles of single strategy that that Steve's course goes over. Obviously, there are deviations to that because you want to be able to analyze the strengths and weaknesses of your opponent, and so you would want to take into account the strengths and weaknesses of your opponent and what you understand about the dimensions of the court and proper tactics, and you would want to combine those two sources of information to come up with a strategy for how you would play. But I think
great what you're saying, because I hear some players say I'm gonna be aggressive. Some players saying no, I'm gonna wait until my opponent make the mistake. But I want to hear from you that you play too many tiebreakers.
Yeah, I mean, I've played a lot of tiebreakers. I would say too, there is an aspect of, looking at the score, if you're up 40-15, what you would call, potentially a green light point, assuming that you've got skills all over the court, that you've got skills from behind the baseline and from the service line in, that, you would look to be maybe more aggressive in certain situations because you understand your aggressive error margin, 2 out of 3 points at the net type of thing. So I think there is an element to that. And it really is kind of going, there's so many variables, right? So like, you might be playing somebody that gets tight, right? Or that they tend to overhit when things get tight. And in that situation, maybe it makes sense to not play as aggressive. Maybe it makes sense to play with more revolutions, a little higher trajectory, and keeping the ball centered to the middle and letting this guy that has a history of implode, right? So I think there's so many variables to take into account. I think the most important thing is to take every point independently and to not let the previous results affect how you approach the next point. I think that's the most important thing. Like a hockey player, hockey goalie, hockey goalies' goal for the next 60 seconds is nobody scores, right? And then if somebody scores, well, dang, but okay, next 60 seconds, nobody scores, right? So the beauty of it is that it resets. And that's what tennis is. Every point is a reset. And what's beautiful about tennis to me is there's no clock. You're not up by 20 in the fourth quarter in a basketball game where there's 30 seconds left and the game's over. It's funny. My most incredible college story, this might have been junior or senior year. Our team, it was the first match of the Ivy League season. And our team was down 3-0 against Penn. And I was playing Jonathan Boyne, who was so annoying for me to play because he was just he made so many balls and I hadn't beaten him my entire career. And I was down 6-1, 4-1. He was serving. So I was down a double break. And I just started screaming after every point that I won. After every point that I won, I just started screaming something positive. And I came back and won that match like 6-4 in the third or something. And then the whole team came back and we won 4-3. But one of the beautiful things about tennis is that it is never over. There's no clock. It is truly, you have to win the last point. So I think you just take every point independently and you don't worry about the rest.
Great advice, Alex. I like your answer and finish with a story. That's great.
With GPA and SAT, I know that. Let's go back to that.
Yeah.
I was told that 1,800 schools now. I mean, Trust and Verify. 1,800 schools right now are allowing students to apply without taking the SAT. I was told that one thing, point of interest, and again, Trust and Verify, that a college may be not taking the SAT, but the NCAA still wants you to take the SAT before you can take a paid visit. But obviously, you tutored some players for us with the SAT. I mean, what are some thoughts you have about that? Obviously, you had to do well to, be admitted to an Ivy League school.
Yeah, no. So I took the SATs back when it was out of 1,600. So I don't know if they went back to that or not. I know.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Okay. So, my biggest advice is that you should prepare for it earlier rather than later. And it doesn't take, it doesn't take money to prepare for it. These days with the internet, there are so many resources available online. There's probably, PDF practice tests that you can find. There's probably YouTube clips that you can find on SAT prep. And I would say be resourceful, be proactive, and prepare for it. Take practice tests, review your practice tests, figure out what you got wrong, figure out why you got it wrong, and figure out how, when you take the test the next time, you'll get the question right, because the questions are the same. The patterns of the questions are the same. It's just different numbers or different words. But with enough practice, you can get to a point where you're scoring pretty well. It's kind of, Steve, like you say, when you miss, know why you miss. When you do poorly on the test, know why you did poorly. Go back and review it, figure out how to correct it.
With the SAT, very few people do this, but you can actually find out what questions you got wrong. And
yeah, I'm sure.
Can you imagine taking a test? I mean, a test is a very good learning tool. If you take a test and you don't review the test, you don't know where you lost points. That's a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you do most of that work on the practice test. I'm sure they make the practice tests that have been given previously available, and you can download them or you can purchase them for a reasonable price, and you can practice off them and see which ones you missed, and then go back and read the explanations. But I can tell you for sure, I am not like, I'm, average to maybe a little above average intelligence, but I've got a very good work ethic. And I was able to score pretty well on the SAT, and it's not because I'm super smart. It's because, I put in the work to get there. Because I can tell you, when I first started taking the SAT, the practice exams, I was not scoring well. And then there was obvious improvement over time. So I would say be proactive about it. Be resourceful about it.
Oh, that's a great answer. The recruiting process, I've got down here Ron Smar, Rice, Bruce Burke at Michigan, Glenn Mitchabot at Princeton, Dave Fish at Harvard. I don't remember, I didn't research it, who the coach at Yale was. Do you remember?
Alex Dorado.
There you go, yeah. Tell us about the recruiting process and how you ended up choosing Princeton.
Yeah, it was... the recruiting process is good. I got a lot of thoughts there. I think it starts your junior year. There's a date. I think it's sometime in June, where before that, they're not allowed to, officially reach out to you. But I remember whenever that day came around, somehow we had a lot of messages on the answering machine from all different programs. And I would say, you know, in some ways I was lucky. I didn't have to put in a ton of work in terms of reaching out to college coaches and things like that to get on the map. I think because Florida is such a high visibility section for college coaches, and the fact that I was ranked higher in the older age groups, I naturally was on people's radars. So it really just came down to, okay, you know, go to a couple of schools that were solid academically, that also had good tennis programs. That was Michigan and Rice. But then for me, I was always very much, you know, coming from my mother's background and her being South Korean and education being very important in our culture, in her culture. Obviously, we wanted to look at several of the Ivies. And so, we looked at Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. I would say maybe for some players that maybe aren't ranked as high, right, that maybe have to put in a little bit more work to get on people's radars, I would use the same approach to the SAT, and that's be proactive and be resourceful. Figure out what the rules are, but go out and make a tape, make a recruiting tape. Write the coaches and write the programs that you're interested in, and take a proactive approach to establishing that connection. I think that goes a long way. So that would be my advice. I think, if your goal is to play world-class tennis someday, you're obviously going to want to look at some of the college programs that tend to have the better players, right? Some of those premier programs like University of Florida, Illinois, Georgia, things like that. If you're more focused on, hey, I want to play 4 years, but I want to get a really good education, that's a different approach. That's, making sure you score well on the SAT. That's making sure that you take, several AP classes, while you're in high school and doing well on those exams. So things of that nature. So it really depends on what your goal is. But the one message that I would say is be proactive, be resourceful. And that's how I would navigate the recruiting process.
With the recruiting process, Dave Fish, he's been a guest on our podcast. There's a story behind that where for 5 years I went to Harvard every year to train the tennis camp staff. But for 12 years, they used our curriculum. Certainly Glenn Michabata, I go way back to, he's a Canadian who spent time in Southern Cal. I remember writer Molly Nickel worked for Tennis Magazine, and she used to travel to tennis camps. And I used to love to just, and she spent a lot of time at Braden's. I used to love to just sit down with Molly and talk to her about these different tennis camps. But she housed Michabata, and I just remember hearing that I knew he was a really good player, obviously, but he was just a delightful guy. But I didn't really know him. But I knew Bruce Burke because he had gone through a little bit of training, but he worked for Craig Tiley, who went through a ton of training because he was with us for years and years. And Ron Smart from Rice, he for a number of years, he used to take it upon himself. He would call me up, and we didn't really have any boys that were at a senior that were ready to play Power 5 or big-time tennis. They used to be in the Southwest Conference. I mentioned Taki Amriti. They were in the top 10 when he was there. But, so tell us a little bit about the coaches or tennis program. I've had people say, well, I like the dorms.
Yeah.
I liked, I really enjoyed the two seniors that showed me around, but I go, yeah, but when you go there, they won't be there. It's amazing what, an 18-year-old, why they will choose one school over the other. But what comes to your mind over the tennis and the academics?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I would say, there's a lot that goes into the decision, right, of where you want to go to school. For me, the education was a very important piece. I knew that, I wanted to go to a school where when I graduated, I was going to have a degree that was going to be useful for me in the workforce if, tennis didn't work out. And so I think at the end of the day, it really was, kind of between Harvard, Princeton, and Yale. And, what I would say when I was looking, across those three programs, I was highly interested in Princeton, and I would say mostly because of the coach, Glenn Michibata, and the fact that he was, unlike the other two, Dorado and Dave Fish, although I'm sure they're, great coaches, Michibata had the playing experience where he was top 50 in the world in singles. He was number one in the world in doubles. He had played in Grand Slam finals. And I thought, look, I can get an awesome education at this place. And then I can also work with somebody who has played tennis at the highest level. And for me, that was just the perfect combination, right? And I would say that was the majority of what my decision was grounded in. But also, when I took the trip to Princeton, I also just felt really comfortable there. I felt comfortable in the campus. I liked the team that he had built there and the personalities of the team that was there. And so everything kind of just felt right, from level of comfort and, hey, this is somewhere I'm going to enjoy being. I've got a coach here who's played world-class tennis that, I've got aspirations to play world-class someday. He's going to have a lot to offer there. And then obviously, a stellar reputation in terms of the quality of the education.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, you play for a great school. It's impressive. Talking about your experience in college and tennis, specific in tennis, what do you think you did right in those years, and what you will do different looking back?
Yeah, that's another really good question. Roberto, man, I'm telling you, the questions, they're high quality questions.
Oh, no, I'm trying to help the young players that they are looking for school and the experience to play college.
Yeah, no, I get it. So, I'll be honest with you. My transition was rough. And it was rough on two fronts. Number one, I came from a public school system where I literally had like 5 minutes of homework a night. Right. And I still, did very well and made straight A's and, graduated near the top of my class in high school. But then going to Princeton, where all of a sudden I had, almost 1,000 pages of material to read every week. And, things were graded on a bell curve where only the top 20% of the class would qualify for like an A grade. Right. On the academic front, it was a major shift for me to where now I was putting many hours a day into trying to learn the material that I was assigned. But then also, on the tennis side, that first half of that year, so there's like that, there's the fall season, and then you kind of have a break, and then you go into the spring season where stuff starts to really matter, and you start to play the interconference dual matches and things like that. I could tell you that first fall, I lost a lot of matches, and I was losing the guys on the team that were not in the starting lineup. And I wasn't in the starting lineup for the first half of that year. And I really, really struggled because at that level, you could go play even a national level tournament in the juniors, and, first couple of rounds are pretty easy. You win 1-1, win 0-0. But at at least at Princeton, even our worst guy, was a really good player. Mm-hmm. And so I really struggled with kind of the jump and the transition to, okay, now it's like higher level competition. There are no real easy matches. And I was also, to be honest, I was kind of in between my old ways of hitting the ball and the information that I was taught, at Steve's. And I had, if you ever ask Len Michibata about my game those first couple of years, my backhand was atrocious. I could not hit topspin off the backhand side. And it's because I did not even realize that I had shifted from more of what you would call a quote unquote Western grip on the backhand, which is how I had always hit it, to more of an Eastern grip on the backhand. I didn't even know that was happening for some weird reason. And I lost all confidence in being able to hit topspin off the backhand. I would fence some balls. The very next ball I'd hit in the bottom of the net. And I was just caught kind of in this weird in-between place. And so I really struggled that first half of that year. But towards the second half, actually, Glenn Michibata, he forced me to take like a couple months off. Like he wouldn't even let me practice with the team. I was actually, because my attitude was so poor, I was actually kind of bringing the entire team down, I would say, which is the negative attitude and the woe is me type of thing. But taking those 2 months away and not being able to practice with the team, I came back with a totally different attitude, missing the game. And by the end of the year, I was, playing 4 and 5 singles. I was a starter through the heart of the year. And I think I won 6. I went like 6-1 or 5-2 in Ivy League play at the end of the year when it mattered, and was nominated maybe for Ivy League Freshman of the Year, but had a really good freshman year playing 4 and 5 singles. And
wow.
But the transition was not a smooth one, to be honest. It was a very difficult one for me.
Let me make a couple comments or add to that. When you said there's no easy matches, I think the parents of juniors themselves, it's not, when you play a dual match, you just show up and you're playing the school's number 2 player, number 5 player. It's not like a junior tournament where you have a couple easy rounds before you play a tougher match. So you got to be really good from the get-go. I've got down in my notes that I coached you from the age of 12, 13, 14. And then in 15, 16, I didn't coach you, but 17 and 18 I did. And of course, after that, then you spent the summers. And, one of the reasons, not to pick on Chuck, but, a boxer and the intensity and discussions, with both parents. I talk to parents all the time. And obviously, I will say that this parent and that parent, they know so much more about 20, 30, 40, 50 topics than I do. But when it comes to tennis, in a lot of ways, they're newbies. Even though their child is 17, 18 years old, they're newbies to the sport. They haven't been in it for years. Or perhaps they haven't even been in sport in general through their childhood. But I know during the recruiting process, I can remember Dave Fish, who maybe, with Bruce Burke, Ron Samar, the 3 that the coaches, I'd have to go back to the 5, in Michibata. So you have 3 of the 5. Had a pretty good handle. Ron Samar being based in Texas. He knew a lot about my background and who I had coached over the years. But so you left the program, and granted, you were never one of these homeschool programs or somebody we were housing, and you came quite a bit, but you were an after-school kid, and I just could share so many experiences. But I remember your father calling me up, and you came back, and you would know Paul. What's Paul's last name?
Segoto.
Yeah, Paul Segoto. So, I was working for Tennis Corporation of America. Doug Cash had hired me to help lead a large indoor facility in Rochester, but also with the possibility of training tennis teachers within the company. So that's where I was. So I flew to Florida, and I remember I ran a doubles clinic for Tomas Olested, who was a former student in this tennis teaching program we talk about. So we could talk about,
I remember him.
Yeah, we'll talk. I just have to mention one name, and I could tell a Tomas story, but Tomas and you. But that at the time, the phrase is, you didn't get it. Let me just say that. Tomas is a very good tennis player, not the best serve. I have a film in my library of Vic Braden giving him a serve lesson. We used to call him the damn Swede. We're not supposed to swear on our podcast, but when I was coaching him, there was 6 out of the top 10 players in the world were Swedish. And he was the best player we had in this tennis teaching program. So he came by to visit, and I put you on a clay court with him, and we just took 12 inches off each sideline. We drew the line, and I said, Alex, this guy's going to kill you.
He whooped me. I remember he whooped me.
And I said,
and I was not happy about it, Steve. I was not happy. That guy was old.
But I said, just take a foot off each side of the baseline, and this guy's going to beat you like the bongos, because you just take the running out of the game, and then your wide serve out of the game. And but Paul, when I was doing this clinic, Paul was playing Ryler to Hart, and I had coached Ryler via video when he was as young as 10, 11 years old. So
we should talk about Ryler, by the way, at some point.
Yeah, we can do that. So with Ryler, so I was going to go watch this match. The clinic was a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and they're both very good junior players. They make the finals on a Monday. And one of my students, who doesn't claim to be one of my students anymore, which is fine, Rafael Fontemora was coaching Paul. Now, coming back to Doug Cash, I remember Doug saying this one time, which I got a kick out of, using my name in third person. He said, once you're a student of Steve Smith, you're a student of his the rest of your life, whether you want to be or not. Because what's going to happen is we have all sorts of students that don't hit the ball well, and I'd like to tell some of the kids we've worked with is keep it a secret that we've coached you. Don't tell anybody that we've coached you. So I just could tell in a New York minute, what happened is it rained, and we just saw enough to see the warm-up, and I think it was just 2 games. I don't think it was any more than 4 games. And I just knew right there, and then that was my experience with Paul. And then your dad gives me a call. This is probably like 5 years later. So I'd already worked with you for 3 years, and your dad calls up and says, hey, can we come in and talk to you? And I said, why don't we do this? Have Alex bring one of his friends, and we'll just play a match, and we'll film it. So instead of helping you with technique for our listeners, what would happen is you would come out an after-school program, and we wanted you to work on forehands and backhands and volleys and serves and overheads, and you'd look to your left and look to your right, and you see these guys, doing live ball, playing sets, and you go, what am I doing over here? This old guy's got a grip sticker on my racket, and he's got got a pencil.
You got me hitting backhands with the pencil.
A pencil on the grip, and so you just had a bad grip on the backhand side, but I can remember going through that. But even that wasn't enough to just go through the slow motion, the stats, the strategy. But it was you could tell me if I'm wrong, but it was a recruiting process where it was either Burke or a combination Burke and Samar, Glenn, or Dave Fish, one of the 3 telling you, Coach Samar, that you need to go back, because then you came back to the program. But even though our listeners are, obviously you're a very articulate, intelligent guy, but the EQ got in the way. It took you so much time. And I think this is true with everyone. You think about, especially a teenage boy is the most unmanageable of them all, is what level of understanding do they really have? What level of understanding do the parents really have? But also, too, is that what level of understanding do the coaches have? We have an article that's been published in many countries, and it's why do people change coaches so much? And the short answer is because the pros do the same thing. The pros, it all starts at the top. The pros are Dimitrov had 7 different coaches in the first 7 years, and but do you have any recollection for being in that room and that day with Paul?
I do. I remember being in that room with.
Is Paul coaching now? Do you know?
He is. He was. So he was actually working for Andrew Golub, who is one of the guys that. So when I left your program, Steve, for that year or 2 years or whatever it was, I went and trained with Alex Golub and Eric Dobsha, who one of them played at FSU, the other played at UF. I think they were both very highly successful players in the NCAAs. Both, were ranked and they were young, right? So they were young. They could still hit the ball. And I tell you what, no offense to them, if they listen to this, but they don't know how to teach somebody to hit the ball in terms of hitting it efficiently. They don't really know that much about that. One of the things that I will give them a ton of credit for is they know how to teach people how to compete. That is, if I could, say there was one thing that I got away from that was that, they didn't really help me with, how to swing the racket, how to move the racket or proper tactics or anything, but they would do crazy things like, okay, you'd have to run, around all 8 of these courts on the outside. And we know that this guy is about 10 seconds faster than you. And so what they would do is they would set you off and they would give you a 9-second head start. And then they would set the guy that's 10 seconds faster than you and have him chase you. And if you got caught, you had to run it again. So they had tons of stuff like that was just taught you to be tough, taught you to compete, taught you not to cower in the face of pressure. They had a ton of stuff like that was incredibly useful that I took with me, into college. But in terms of, understanding of technique, understanding of biomechanics, understanding of tactics, I mean, the stuff that I learned under you is unparalleled and unrivaled, I would say. So, yeah.
I appreciate that comment. You started off with that. I appreciate that. But at the same time, what you're saying about them is I know that, and they're still doing the same thing, is hats off to them. I mean, parents need to realize that you need both. We've taught a lot of people that have pretty strokes that can't play. You need both. And as parents that have kids that are, hopefully going to play college tennis. I mean, they're college tennis bound. They got to get it done now. And the one thing about the curriculum we put together, and there's so much history behind it, I think Wayne Bryan said it so well, is that a lot of things the USTA was doing for 10-year-olds, he goes, that's all great, but that's what 6-year-olds need to do. And it's just delayed. And but really, a great base, who can argue with someone having a great base? But by the time a kid's 9 years old, they're halfway to the age of 18, you should be able to toss a ball to them, any ball, and they just have very clean, efficient technique.
Yeah. And, which is why, Steve, that my son is going to be down there with you in a couple of years when he can, hold and swing a racket. So be ready for him. He's on the way.
How old is Blaze now?
He's almost 3.
But coming back to that afternoon when you're in that match, or I should say you're in the classroom and we're, tearing a match apart, technique and tactics, what recollection you have for that?
I'm sorry, repeat that?
So you and Paul came in, you played a match, it was
right.
Saturday afternoon. I remember it like it was yesterday. And one of the reasons for memory is adrenaline. It's like, okay.
I just remember, I'll tell you a couple things on that. With the interaction with Paul, I don't remember it a ton other than I was a crappy sportsman. I remember that I was losing points and I was being a baby about it. And I remember you commented on it, how I was being kind of a baby about it. And I hated that. And I reflected back on that. And I was kind of embarrassed by that. But I'll tell you what I remember more was when you brought me out to play Austin Krajicek. I don't know if you remember that, but you brought me out to play Austin Krajicek. And Chad Berryhill was there, if you remember Chad.
Oh, yeah.
And Krajicek, I used to beat up on Krajicek when he was younger than me. But, he was older now, and it goes back to what you said, right? Braun versus whatever it was. But Krajicek had better skills than me, bottom line. And I think he beat me 6-4. And, Chad was filming it. And then at the end of the set, I remember you laid into me. It was one of I've had plenty of you laying into me, but this was one of the epic you laid into me's that I remember. And, you were saying stuff like you would have been better off taking a bus to practice, than driving that convertible. And, just things like, you don't get it. You don't get your ass from your elbow, things like that. And I was just thinking, and I reflect back on that, and you're absolutely right. And you were trying to tell me that I didn't get it, which, Steve, I did not get it. I didn't get it till I was 24 teaching students after I was done playing.
With,
yeah.
I was going to say with Austin Krajicek, for our listeners, I mean, he was just on the Olympic team. He was representing the United States in the Olympics. he's got quite a background. I mean, he won Kalamazoo. Those in America, that's like the junior tournament.
Yeah.
San Diego for girls and Kalamazoo for boys, the 18s. Winner gets to go to the U.S. Open, play in the first round, hopefully second, third. But so one year at the junior U.S. Open, Austin Krajicek and Jameer Jenkins did really well. So they came to spend a week with us. And Jameer had been there before. Rob brought him, and we remember making a video for him. And what a talent, what a great guy. And but the thing is, we make a video, and then they take it home, and then who can really help them with it? Who's going to take that information? Because there's tennis intelligence applied. You have to be able to. It's not just the information; you have to be able to apply it. So Krajicek and Jameer, they came in to play a week of doubles in a summer camp, and so you were there. You were, I can't remember what year it was. One of the summers from during the Princeton school year, and my son Connor. And he's the same age, give or take, as Austin Krajicek, Jameer Jenkins. And I told you guys, I said, all right, you're going to do this, and these guys are going to get one serve. You're going to get 3 serves. They're going to play all these different sets. They're going to play you where it's love 40. They're serving love 40. They're serving love 30. And I said, you guys just got to put up with all this situational training. And at the end, in front of the summer camp, you'll be able to play them straight up. And I'll keep in mind, you're a few years older, and they're just, I think it would be their last year at the U.S. Open, so they're 18 years old, and they're pretty fast tracked. I think both of those young guys, they went to, like Austin went to his senior year in high school. He's playing at A&M. I think Jenkins may have done the same thing.
Yep.
So these guys were solid, but that's how that's where
I think Jenkins played at Virginia.
Yeah, that's right. He got to the NCAA finals. He lost to Blazrola from Ohio State, Slovenian.
Right.
So, and we do have a fact checker out there who lets me know if I make any mistakes. So we're gonna interview our incognito fact checker. But But anyway, what I remember just that was it. I mean, it was just like the light bulb went off, and I went, "Whoa, this guy Vuckovic." And I had known you a long time. I go, "This guy is just a sick competitor." I mean. You gave us the yelling and screaming, and it was like that match was like the most important thing in your life. And I remember you and Austin, you and Connor, you guys were on the winning side of that. But they're just practicing, getting ready for the U.S. Open, so they're pretty flat going to our little boring tennis camp. They're going to New York City and going to Flushing Meadows, and you guys like this is it. But But that's where I found out that sometimes that people are so competitive that they can't change their strokes. I mean, there's just so much interference, so much self-destruction because they want to win so badly. But you showed us that day how crazy you were.
Yeah, no, I was pretty crazy. But yeah, I agree. Like I said, it was competitiveness and ego that made it really hard for me to change my strokes. And but you know what? I play a lot these days, and I film myself. And you see, I've sent you film of what I'm doing, what I'm working on, and I have made some meaningful changes in the way that I grip and swing the racket. And I can tell you that today, when I play, I have options. That's the key word right there, options. I have options that I never had before. And that's an amazing feeling, and I'm just, I'm excited to continue to work on my game. And, who knows, maybe someday I can, I could be number one in the 40 and overs or something like that.
No, it's great. No, I remember my son Connor, with when he, so you're 86, he's 90. Just think, all right, you're 18, he's 14, give or take, and he was a better tennis player at 14 than you were at 18, even though you might have beat him like 0-0. Go ahead, I get a beeping phone here. Can you hear me, Alex?
Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. Our listeners have to give you that for that beep, but I tried to turn it off. Machine is only as smart as its operator. But with Connor, so remember you using that term is that, he has so many more options. just like when someone's ready to return serve. I mean, you just make a unit turn and your ready position is a forehand volley. Simplicity. And I also remember you following him when he spent 3 years playing pro tennis, and I remember you asking me to have Connor come and see you, and because you guys spent a lot of time together. And I said, yeah, I'll make that happen. I put on an airplane, and he came to see you. And I remember Connor going, he has no right to talk to me like that. And I go, Connor, that's why you're not going to have that breakthrough, because you gave him a little bit of fertilizer, and he didn't want to use the fertilizer. You only grow if you use fertilizer. Roberto, go ahead.
Yeah.
Alex, after talking about juniors in college, and I heard that, and of course you are coaching, you have all the experience and be around many coaches, I'm sure. If you walk in a facility and are practicing, juniors all around the courts, and you walking into the facility, what's the first thing where you're looking into a player?
What's the first thing that I'm going to look at in terms of the player that I'm watching? What's the first thing I'm going to analyze?
Yes, what are you looking first in a player?
I think it's a great question. You mean if he walks into like a junior development program, you're just a fly on the wall, innocent bystander, and you come in, no one knows who you are. What do you see?
The first thing I'm going to look at is how are they moving the racket. I'm immediately what I go to for whether that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do. I immediately judge the program based off of the level of efficiency of the strokes of the players.
No, that's a good answer.
Great, that's a good answer. Yes. What you're saying is racket skills.
Yeah, because I think, look, I think that one of the things about me, this might be a little bit strange, but, I spent a lot of time studying for the LSAT because I was going to go to law school for a while and ended up not going, but, did pretty well on the exam. But they teach you about these things called, necessary and sufficient conditions, right? Not to get overly complicated, but the bottom line is if you're not efficient with your strokes, you pretty much have no chance of playing world-class tennis. But it's not a sufficient condition, right? Like, if you have really efficient strokes, it's not a guarantee that you'll play world-class tennis. But what I do know is that if you're not efficient, you pretty much have zero shot. And so, that gets into necessity and sufficiency. But so one of the things I immediately look at is, does this kid even have a shot? And the first thing that I look at, to determine if somebody has a shot is how efficient do they move the racket. Hopefully that made sense.
No, that's a great answer. You have two kids. When I ask parents, athlete parents, you want your kid to play soccer or tennis. Some of them say no. I heard that. I think you want them to play tennis.
I do. I do want my kids to play tennis. My daughter isn't born yet, but she's due here in the beginning of July. So I'm going to have a 3-year-old boy and a newly born daughter. I want them both to be tennis players. I hope.
Great.
I'm going to expose them to lots of different sports. My wife, I hope she doesn't listen to this, is not the most athletic person in the world. So I hope they get more of the athletic stuff from me. But I want to put them in things like gymnastics, right? And things that make you use your whole body. As they're growing up to help develop just the overall mastery over their own body and their balance and how the body works. And then, hopefully they end up liking tennis because I'm definitely going to put a racket in their hands. At the same time, I'm not going to force it. If it's something that they just really don't like, I'm not going to force it. But I truly hope that they end up enjoying the sport and making the decision that that they want to, see how good they can get at the sport. And it's going to be all about getting that great base, Steve. So just be ready for Blaze to be down there in a year or two.
We're ready. Let me ask you about Princeton. What was your major?
Political science.
And I read, all I got to do is, with the computer days, plug in your name, Alex Vuckovic, Princeton, and read where your favorite course was moral philosophy. What was that class about?
Oh, man. I tell you what. The most useful courses that I took at Princeton were the philosophy courses, because they're grounded in logic and they teach you how to think. It's interesting because of the way, Princeton was the only Ivy League school that instituted this grade deflation approach, which they instituted the first year that I got there. It was like the first time they were putting this into effect. And it was basically where, the top 25% of the class could get an A- or higher. But if you weren't in the top 25%, even if you had, say, like a 98 average in calculus, if 25% of the class had a 98 or higher, like, you could only qualify for a B+ grade. So what was difficult about that was it really made me shy away from the things that I was actually interested in, which was more of the quantitative, less subjective material, like things like mathematics and economics and things like that. But I shied away from them because I knew I just was not as gifted as, some of those other students. So I stuck with what I was good at, which was reading and writing. And so a lot of that resulted in philosophy classes, which at the end of the day, though, were extremely helpful to me. And moral philosophy was great because it really taught you, it taught you how to have an open mind, and it taught you, things, it taught you to think about ideas, like the idea that values are potentially subjective, that there is no objective truth for, what could be right or what could be wrong. I remember reading, a couple of papers in that class, things that would talk about different cultures. So, for example, this is a very, strange example, but in America, right, like if somebody invites you over for dinner and you eat dinner and you let out a huge burp or a belch, right, that would be considered rude, kind of rude. Like, geez, that was kind of disgusting. Why did you just do that? But then in some other cultures, belching or burping at the end of the meal is a sign of thank you. Like, man, that was really good food. Thank you so much. So the underlying value there is that you're demonstrating appreciation for the food and the hospitality, but the way in which you're demonstrating it maybe is different. And so, taking classes like that at Princeton, moral philosophy, make you more open-minded, more tolerable of different concepts or different ways of thinking about things. I tell you what, that was great. So I loved that class. It blew my mind.
Do they have it at Princeton, like they do at Harvard? Can you shop classes? Like they have a 3-day period where you can go listen to a professor and decide if you want to take the class?
Yep, absolutely. There is a shopping period. So you get a feel for the material. You get a feel for the professor, their personality, how they're going to grade the class, and you can choose to continue with it or move on to a different one.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, I really like what you said, that philosophy helps you to think.
Yeah.
I heard a long time ago that the philosophers should be politicians. And the politicians should study philosophy. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think philosophy gets a bad rap. I think it's incredibly useful. I think it's incredibly useful for teaching you to think in a way that's critical and constructive. And I think in terms of my career, I've got a pretty good career. And I think a lot of my success in my career field, I largely attribute it to many of the philosophy classes that I took, in addition to, believe it or not, the 9 months that I spent studying for the LSAT. Those are probably two of the most, important things that I've taken with me in the way that I think about how I do things. So yeah, I would say philosophy is a great thing to study. It's not just about, sitting in a chair and thinking about what the meaning of life is. I think it has very, practical purposes to it.
I used to call my brother Matt Phil, short for philosophical. And I got, like young boys, I got in some trouble one time, and I remember my brother Matt gave me some advice. He goes, "Whatever you do, be busy. Even if you're just in the driveway pounding two rocks together, but don't be sitting on the couch, because it's just going to get the old man ready to push the more buttons."
Alex, you use also a word critical. I heard also a long time ago, when a society stops to be critical, doesn't grow. What do you think about it?
Yeah, no, I think that it's important to think critically. Roberto, you're diving into politics a little bit now. Not to get too political, but I would just say that in the climate that we're in, it's important to remember that democracy, in some ways, is founded and depends on healthy disagreement. Yeah. Okay. And I just think it's important for people to remember that people are going to have different viewpoints, and it's important to be able to disagree in a way that's civil, in a way that's healthy, and in a way that's productive.
Oh, that's well put.
Yeah.
I think with philosophy, though, when it comes to tennis, philosophy is a problem. People need to have their own inner philosophy, written philosophy, but it's not philosophical. The strings have to point towards the target.
Right.
With Steve,
on that real quick, where I think maybe the art comes into the tennis is the delivery of the information. I think that's where there's room for an artistic approach. There's not necessarily one right way to do it, but I think, and even in some ways, the information, right? Tennis it's a science, just like anything else. And over time, we learn more and more about the subject, and the subject evolves over time. There are certain fundamental principles that likely will never be disproved, but over time, it will continue to evolve. Certain, physical theories that were proposed by Newton or Einstein or whatever, some of them over time, as we get new evidence, maybe are overturned. But, so I think it's important to remember that in some ways, tennis does evolve, technology, information, science. But what really gets me is that, people look at the pros and they look at how they strike the ball. What is the most annoying thing to me about that is where they point to the idiosyncrasies that don't really matter, right? So they point to the things that are maybe slightly different, but don't have a substantial impact on the level of efficiency that person is striking the ball with. And so, I just think that it's important to remember that, yes, the technique and everything, as we learn more information, information changes, the sport evolves. And I think the technical side of it is more concrete, but definitely in terms of the delivery of the information, I think there is a lot of room there to explore, what the best ways are to do that, to transfer the information effectively.
No, for sure. That's where it is a science, but it's also an art. Coming back to moral philosophy, just the course title. I was 26 years old with really no formal training to put together an academic curriculum, but I had to come up with course titles. But one of your teammates had behavioral science, and I remember Russell Crowe.
That's probably Mark Gober.
From Slovakia.
Oh no, that's Peter Kapkovich.
I don't remember, but I was going to ask you about your doubles partner, but with which was Peter, correct?
Yep. Peter, he was my doubles, and he was from Slovakia.
Russell Crowe, the Aussie, was on a talk show, and this was back in 2008, 2009, where the U.S. government was bailing out, the auto industry or banks and da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah.
And he said, and that was in the billions of dollars, and with 330 million Americans at the time, he said, this makes me think of behavioral science. He said, why don't you just give every American $1 million? He said, that'll make the economy grow. I mean, some people will be buying cocaine, and some people will be buying motorcycles, but that would have got going. But with the Ivy League, I coached many kids that have played in the Ivy League and the Ivy League tennis division. In fact, we have one visiting here who's currently playing. Season's over. But what I tell the Ivy Leaguers is, you want to be elite, but never be an elitist. Would you comment on that? Don't you think a lot of the Ivy Leaguers need to be slapped across the head?
Yes, I would agree with that. First of all, I would say, 10% of the, folks that are in Princeton are just, folks that are legacy, or they're the sons and daughters of very, very wealthy people, right? So, you get a fair amount of that. But I think it's important, to be grounded and to be humble and to not be elitist. And I think there's different angles to elitism. But in terms of, to apply it to tennis, don't be a tennis elitist. Don't feel like you've always got to play with somebody that's better than you. I play it quite a lot here in Charleston, and, most of the folks that I play with, I would say are, probably a level or two below me, but you can still get such great practice out of playing with somebody that maybe is not quite at your level. There's so much good technical work that you can do to work on your form, to work on your game. It's the perfect opportunity to check the ego, right? And to work on things that are actually important to work on to improve your game. Anybody can toss you a ball. You can be playing with a 2-0 player or whatever, and just they toss you 20, and then you toss them 20, and you alternate for 2 hours, and you work on your game. So I would say, it's good practice, not to be an elitist. And I would say, there's definitely plenty of that in the culture at Princeton. But I would also say that one of my favorite things about Princeton was the student body, and even in some ways more so than the professors, was just your peers and the incredible things that they were doing, and the incredible conversations that you would have, at midnight on a Tuesday night as, you were taking a study break. So in general, I would advise people, it's nice to be humble and not to be elitist.
Study break at midnight, so a few sleepless nights when you were at Princeton, huh?
Yes, there were a good amount of those, I would say. Yep.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, I always trying to use your experience, and as a junior, as a college player, and now as a coach, did you see any difference between boys and girls when you are in the way to develop players and go to college?
No, I don't think there's any substantial difference. What I will say is that you look at some of the top women, right, on tour. I will say their technique is not as clean as the technique on the men's side. And I will say that just simply comes down to the speed of the ball. the speed of the ball objectively is significantly faster on the men's side than the women's side. And so this is the reason why you'll see, somebody like a Sloane Stephens. I watch Sloane Stephens hit the ball on the forehand side, and I think, oh my goodness, please, you got like 6 feet of extra movement that you don't need on that thing. But Sloane Stephens is a U.S. Open champion, if I remember. I think she's won a slam. I don't know if it's U.S. Open, but
she did win the U.S. Open.
But I look at that forehand and I just think, man, you could cut 6 feet out of that thing. And it goes back to our initial discussion about Hewitt with the reset backhand. Always compare yourself to your potential. The speed of the ball on the women's side is slower. Man, if you took Hennon's forehand and you gave that forehand technique to Sloane Stephens, you're looking at potentially 10 slams. In terms of the ball doesn't know if it's being hit by one hand or two hand. It doesn't know if it's being hit by a man or a woman, a 12-year-old or a 30-year-old. I would think that you would approach the framework in terms of the biomechanics and the blueprint, and certainly the tactics. All of that would be the same. If there was a difference, I think it would be maybe in the delivery of the information, but I don't think that's necessarily across man versus woman. I think that's just more the Myers-Briggs brain type. You got, 16 different brain types. You get INTJs, ENTJs, whatever it is. I think it would be really important to, one of the first things I did with Steve, Matthew, one of the first things I did with Matthew was go take this Myers-Briggs test, understand what brain type he is, because I think that's going to influence the way in which you would want to try to communicate and deliver information. So more so than the sex that they are, I would try to understand what brain type are they, and then I would try to understand how that would influence the way in which I would deliver information.
For our listeners, to backtrack, with Andy Fitzell, who spent so much time with Vic Braden, we dedicated a podcast to brain type. I wanted to ask you about leadership. You could talk about your doubles partner. You were both captains at the same time, your senior year. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Ryan Kim, who I coached, and I wasn't really the primary coach. He used to come and spend quite a bit of time with us in Tampa, but Randy Raskin spent so much time with him. He's actually an orthopedic surgeon now. A lot of years have gone by. He just would not force. And I can remember same thing, he was, and again, as a parent, my son Connor, I remember you and Ryan both were like, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy. Well, but he's not 14 anymore. And at our facility in Tampa against Dennis Navola, who played, a high level. I remember being at a challenger. He was in the final, played at Illinois. But the two of them, they played a final. It wasn't at level 1, level 2. I believe it was a level 2 final. And I don't think they hit one volley or one overhead. But, stubbornness can work for you, but a lot of times stubbornness just turns into stupid. But I remember Ryan, and you'd have to tell me that he didn't finish his playing career. He stopped. But I can remember at the same time, Princeton was looking for an assistant coach, and I was training Miran Mann, who's a guest on one of our podcasts. And I remember talking to Glenn Michabata and saying, I suggested, and I was very aggressive. I said, why don't you have Alex. Have Alex. He's a captain. Run captain's practice for 2 days, 3 days, and get on an airplane and come down here and spend some time with us. I told Dave Fish this years ago. I think you're molded by your job, and he spent so many years at Harvard. It's quite difficult when you're coaching kids that are, not prejudged as being geniuses, but you just know there's some book smarts in the room. But how did you handle, you said you had some problems with, breaking into college as a freshman. Glenn gave you a really good lesson by having you sit out for a while, and you came back and were a contributing member of the team. You became captain. I remember that very well with because Miron was looking for work and talking to Glenn and trying to get Ryan not to quit. But how did you do as a leader? I mean, obviously you can lead by example, but lead by voice. And I do think a lot of times, even a sophomore, as a freshman comes in, and I tell kids that are going to college, you're 18 going in, but there's going to be 19-year-olds ready to give you the gears because they went through the same thing when they were freshmen. Talk a little bit about leadership in college tennis.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the things that I did the best. Once I got past that initial rough transition first half of my freshman year, I would say even as early as second half of freshman year, I was one of the emotional and spiritual leaders of that team. It's hard to describe, I guess, how you be a leader, but I think one of the things is certainly lead by example. You don't ever ask folks to do things that you're not willing to do or demonstrate yourself. And I think always, bringing energy and bringing positivity and, trying to uplift people when you see that they're down and figuring out, how to motivate people. Because, you need to approach people different ways because they have different personalities and they respond to stimuli in different ways. One of the things that I really focused on was, and I wasn't this, the first part of my freshman year, but being consistent. And not necessarily in terms of consistency of the level of play, consistency and the level of attitude. So even if I was having an off day, I was always upbeat, always being loud, always making sure we were intense, we were focused. And, I would say, one of the things that was a huge lesson for me was this concept of low negativity versus high negativity. And, low negativity is, your shoulders are slumped, you're moping around, you're thinking, woe is me. High negativity is you've got great body language. You're letting out a loud scream of frustration. Maybe you're throwing your racket 6 courts away, but at least you're high negative. And for sure, there were times where I was high negative. But I think, it's very difficult to be a leader if you're displaying low negativity where you're moping around. You've got poor body language. So yeah, I don't know. It's one of the harder things to describe. It's one of the things that I think came a little bit more naturally to me. I think part of it comes from being more outward, being, high energy, being generally positive, and being extremely competitive and not afraid of pressure.
Talk a little about your doubles partner. That's great words.
Peter. I love Peter. Peter Kapkovich was I'm not going to get his age right, but he might have been a 24-year-old freshman that at one point was, I think, top 300 in the world, from Slovakia. Keep in mind, this guy had probably a top 25 in the world two-handed backhand, but also was slightly overweight and couldn't do a pull-up. No offense, Peter, if he ever hears this, but at that point, he was kind of, he didn't really have aspirations to play at that point after college. He was focused on, learning what he could learn and then translating that into a successful career in investment banking, which I think he's done today. But he was an extremely high quality tennis player. I am not exaggerating when I say he had a top 25 in the world two-handed backhand. He had wins over guys like Baghdadis. I think there was another guy, Volskov. Volskov, I think, might have made the semis of Wimbledon at one point. Peter had a win over him, I think either the week before or the week after he made the semis of Wimbledon. He had beaten Radek Stepanek. So, he had beaten some really world-class players and was definitely, I would say, probably the best player in the Ivy League for the 4 years that I was there, but also highly, highly intelligent. He was a super, super smart guy. You know, he would compete in these like, you know, mock stock markets where you can invest in these different companies, not in real life, but then, you know, you could compete against others in terms of investments. And he would always be like top 5%, like in the entire world, basically in competing in these different types of events. And just extremely talented, extremely bright, and not quite as motivated as some of the others on the team, but by far and away the best player that we had. And the other interesting thing about him was he could not volley. He'll tell you differently, but no offense, he couldn't volley. And that's why a lot of the time, even off his service games, we play one up, one back, because he just didn't want to hit that first volley. But yeah, so I love Peter. He's a great teammate, great person to be around, nice guy, very smart, incredible backhand.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Alex, why do you think the tendency is to move in more and more to play mediocre doubles all around the world?
So I think that there are a lot of factors that go into that. One I would point to is just the level of tennis instruction, I think, is continuing to deteriorate. And so just, you know, the level of competition is deteriorating. But also I think the technology plays a role. You know, so the material that the rackets are made out of, the types of balls that they use, the technology and the string. You know, I think in some ways the technology has changed. It hasn't changed the geometry of the game. The geometry of the game stays the same. It's just that now it's maybe easier to hit tougher, or it's easier to play the ball into smaller areas of the court because of the technology that's afforded the players. So even though the black and white geometry is the same, the ability to play into smaller portions of the court at a higher percentage has increased as a result of the technology. So I think that, combined with the fact that the instruction pretty much across the board has deteriorated, has contributed to what you're seeing in doubles today.
I think it's well said. People want to win. They want to win, you know, the 2-inch trophy, the 10 and unders. The player wants to win. The parent wants the player to win. The coach wants the player to win. And, you know, everybody knows, you know, you go to the net to lose at a faster rate. And you need two things to be a serve and volley player. You need a serve and a volley. And kids will play 5 years of tennis and they don't even know they have a palm-up serve. And they're taught poor mechanics from the grip to the swing. I want to touch base on two experiences. This should happen more often. I know you were in San Diego, bright guy, and I, to this day, don't know anybody else who's done this, but you found photos of tennis players, and you found you found the emails of the parents of the tennis players, and then because you were in San Diego and you needed to pay some bills, and you needed to find some students. And, you know, again, Sloane Stephens, great athlete, U.S. Open champion, hats off to her. But, you know, and there are some people out there saying, you know, Madison Keys, you can have a big forehand if you want to. You can have a huge swing behind your back. I don't think people speculate, go, well, she's top 10 in the world, and they rationalize that you can hit the ball any way you want. But I don't think there'd be an argument if you could turn the clock back and take two people who have the same support system and put in so much blood, sweat, and tears, if those two players had better ball striking skills. You know, if we could turn the clock back and ask Nick Baltieri, well, if Jim Courier had Andre Agassi's backhand from day one, how would Jim done? I mean, because he obviously was such a champion with a hole in his game. But tell us a little about taking photos and how that transpired and how that worked for you.
How did you know about that? How did you know that I had these? I looked up photos of players and then emailed the parents.
Well, my memory is very good. I recall, total recall.
So I must have told you. That.
I was teaching tennis teachers in Denver, and you showed up. I think it was Zoe.
Oh, that's right. It was Zoe. That's
Scandalis,
right.
who played at USC. So
Yeah.
she shows up, and
So
you just walk in, and I go, how does Alex Vuckovic walk in the room in Denver? We're at this indoor tennis complex. And you got a very good player. At that time, I think she was on her way to go to USC. And you had her father convinced. And I said, how'd this happen? And you said, I just took some photos. Then I wrote I wrote him a technical analysis just based on a standstill, just one photo.
So that's right. So it's a little bit creepy, but I looked. So I was in San Diego and I needed to pay some bills, and I wasn't really sure, what I wanted to do post Princeton. So I needed to just teach tennis, to pay the bills while I figured out what I wanted to do. So I looked up, who the top juniors were in the country, in San Diego, in the San Diego area. And I came up with a list of kids, and Zoe Scandalis was one of them, who went on to play, I think, number 1 at USC. And another was Gabby DeSimone, who also went to go play at USC. I think she might have played 4 or 5 for them. But at the time, both of those players were top 10 in the country in the 18s. And I just looked up Facebook photos of them because, tennis players typically have photos of them playing tennis on Facebook. So I looked up photos of them with these ridiculous backswings, right? I mean, I'm talking about, on the forehand side for Zoe, her backswing going back behind the hitting shoulder, by a couple feet. And I simply emailed her dad, saying, hey, here's a photo of your daughter. Here's how, her backswing is going 2 feet behind her hitting shoulder, which means that it's got to go 2 feet forward as well, which translates into 4 feet of movement that she doesn't need to hit an efficient forehand. And the reason for that is that because the shape of the court is really a long, narrow, skinny rectangle. And here's a picture of the court from the sky, about 100 feet in the air. Look at that. I bet you didn't think that the court looked like that from the sky. And so this is why you don't want her swinging predominantly horizontally. You really want her swinging more like a Ferris wheel vertically. And this is something that I could help your daughter with. And by the way, I played at Princeton, for 4 years. I was number 2 in Florida. And then, that's the way that I initially got her on the court with me for the first time. And once I got her on the court with me, same story with Gabby. I feel like, once you explain the information to people, a lot of times you're going to get a positive response. It's just that they haven't had the fortune of being around good information, which in some ways is fortuitous. But the way in which you can reduce the fortuitiveness of it is by being proactive and resourceful in everything that you do. So if you're trying to figure out how to be the best tennis player possible, if you do some serious research, at some point, chances are you're going to land on Vic Braden. And from there, you're probably going to land on Steve Smith. So, yeah, just some thoughts there.
Actually, Russ Hamilton told me, mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, he was recently at a tournament and there's a service. It was quite expensive. I think it was $200, where I'm not sure, maybe 1,000 photos. So you get all sorts of photos, and and then they're in a sequence as well. So that's something that to look forward to. I've got one I'll come back to next on a different experience that you had. But Roberto, go ahead.
Alex, I really like that you're getting even into video analysis. And what do you think about now that tennis is moving in the direction of hitting forehands and hitting that forehand, when the head coaches now saying, I have the new forehand, and adding movements where the head racket is in front, and What do you think about that?
You're talking about this concept of like the modern forehand versus like the old school forehand.
Yes.
Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, look, so I think that obviously the way that the forehand is hit today is different than the way it was hit in the 1920s, but it's not as different as people think, in the sense that, okay, maybe today people are hitting more topspin, right? So maybe there is this element of getting further below the ball and swinging with more racket head speed and swinging vertically, whereas in the 20s with wooden rackets, you were swinging maybe more through the ball, and maybe that is a change, right? That you have to take into account. Maybe, if I remember correctly, Borg was maybe one of the first ones to really start hitting top off the forehand side. But what's so interesting is that there's this YouTube video. I don't know where it is, but it is a side by side comparison of Federer and Borg hitting forehands. And the similarities are shocking. It's like they are so similar. So at the end of the day, it gets back to my point about, when I talked about people focus on the idiosyncrasies that don't really matter or that don't have as big of an impact. At the end of the day, it's like, I run into folks where I'm like, yeah, you really want to kind of swing this way. And the way I explain it very simply at a high level is, be more like a Ferris wheel, less like a merry-go-round. At the end of the day, that's one of the simplest ways to put it. But what you're really saying is swing on the plane that makes sense when you look at the shape of the court, right? And I think that even from the very beginning of tennis, people have always swung on that kind of north-south plane. I think, one of the primary things maybe that's changed is the upward angle of the swing, right? Where maybe it's gotten steeper these days as a result of technology and just knowledge to hit more revolutions, right? So I think it's a combination of, yes, there is kind of a new way to hit the ball, but some of the fundamental principles are always going to be the same, and those are never going to change. And no matter what, everybody is going to be subjected to the same physical laws and the same dimensions of the court. And you are going to have to figure out what the most efficient way is to move the racket based off of those parameters. And our knowledge of what the most efficient way is to do that, I think, is constantly changing, constantly improving as knowledge and technology and science and things like that gets better.
No, it's well put. Coming back to a couple of things, Jimmy Arias, his father worked for Niagara Mohawk in the Buffalo, New York area. He's somebody who really let that shoulder be loose and has circular forehand. And certainly he's given a lot of credit for the modern forehand because Balotelli just said that's the Balotelli forehand, but it was really the Jimmy Arias forehand. But John Newcomb, who couldn't really hit topspin on the backhand side, great player, Wimbledon champion, #1. He had the windmill forehand. You think about Tommy Acker. But people just need to, from the Netherlands, people just need to really study tennis. Granted, for a long time, sure, the grip was an issue on the forehand side, but because people with the bad grass and people wearing spikes, I mean, they were using a continental grip, and one grip on every shot seemed to make sense. But, coming back to someone I'm sure you know, Jeff Lewis, was he around when you were around?
Oh, yeah. I remember Jeff Lewis. I remember a couple of times he came out to teach me, and he was like, man, we haven't been hard enough on you. He's like, you got to do this, you got to do that. I'm going to show you how to do this. And I just loved his energy. Jeff Lewis was an incredible athlete. I mean, that guy, he could jump 3 picnic tables.
Well, actually, to be factual, he could jump 2. But that was length. That was not side by side. That was 2 as far as the length. There was an academy, the Palmer Academy. They had Jeff come to the physical fitness just so he could demo. Great athlete physically. Like all of us, he could have connected a few more wires on the mental side playing. But no, amazing. But he has a great video. People should look it up. Just put forehand spoof, And coming back, I mentioned the parent, Russ Hamilton, said that, we first started listening to our podcast, we came across as know-it-alls. So, Jeff, there's a scene where he's the old forehand, the new forehand, the so-called modern forehand. Maybe listeners need to look that up. But, I'll make this comment. You go to the NCAAs and you see these gals, athletic and fit, and then you see them play doubles. It's really 3-5 doubles. I went to an excellent clinic just to listen to a presentation today, and it was on country club doubles. Or club doubles. It was fantastic. How do you play with no strokes, basically? How do you play one up, one back? And it was really well done. I know Roberto spent years helping me with Victor Lillo. Was he around when you were around, or was that you weren't there in those days? I think
Victor Little, that doesn't ring a bell.
Yeah, so he's a young junior that we've coached, and he won the 12s and this and that, won the Orange Roll, won the La Petite. Last year was in the junior Wimbledon final, and his sister's a scholar, and she spent a ton of time with us. And I remember she was charting; she was taught to chart, and she got through her exams in May, and she was charting matches from the NCAA. And we were not at the NCAAs, and I just said to her, she goes, all the players are playing the same. They're just staying back and run around backhands and just hitting forehands, trying to hit forehands. Chris Clore launch missiles from everywhere. And I said, watch UCLA's player Marcus Guerin. And I know my son won a couple doubles tournaments with him. And lo and behold, he wins the tournament. And she said to me, how did you know that? And I said, well, I'm not really that familiar, but I know that he's one of the best, most efficient players in the tournament, and he used to be somebody to bet on. Here's an experience that you had I want to talk about a little bit. The USPTA and PTR, so you coming out of Princeton, and it was between, so you finish your graduate degree and what you're going to do. And so the USPTA and PTR, they have a code of conduct. Like, so if I'm visiting a tennis facility, I'm not going to teach at that facility. Actually, if I'm visiting a tennis facility, it's part of the USPTA PTR code of conduct that I should introduce myself, go up and introduce myself as a fellow USPTA PTR pro. But correct me wrong, but this is the story, and you can finish it, add to it. You're in New York, but it's too expensive to live in New York City, so you are going to stay with a college friend in the D.C. area. Mm-hmm. And through that experience, you make a phone call to the Junior Championship Tennis Center.
Yep.
And, certainly you get their attention when you say, well, I'm looking to teach tennis, and I played at Princeton. That's kind of a, it's not really fair to Princeton. You always hear Harvard in the movies. They drop the H-bomb.
You know what the major bargaining chip was there when I made that phone call?
Robin
was
Anderson.
Robin.
Yeah, so
yep.
That's in
I told him I was training Robin.
That's in my notes, and she was here, like 10 days ago to work on her serve, and I thought she was number one in the country. She's very humble. She said she was number two, but so she was one of the better players. And your connection with her, she's from New Jersey, and you started working with her. Princeton's in New Jersey. Mm-hmm. I remember Chuck Creasy, who's a great, great speaker. He was a guest on our podcast. He called me up, and he was so impressed with your knowledge. But then things turned sour a little bit, and there's always two sides to the story. But the head coach at that time was Frank Salazar, who was highly decorated for the results of Junior Ore, Mitchell Frank, and Dennis Kudla. Later, and I could ask you were there. What did you think of a young TFO? But I remember you'd called me up, and you just were green. You were just out of college and didn't know the ways of the world or the ways of the wild, weird, and wacky world of tennis teaching. But I remember you telling Kudla, you got a world class backhand, but you got to tweak your forehand. You got to make some adjustments on your forehand. Mm-hmm. Or Mitchell Frank on his forehand. Junior Ore being just a speedster, a retriever from the baseline. But that turned into where Junior was going to turn pro, and you thought that he should go to college, and then you brought Junior and Robin down. They ended up spending a semester. Junior came with his grandfather Eddie. They were going to spend 4 days, and they ended up with you spending 4 months. And so I was coaching you to coach them, and that was another experience. But so you spent a lot of time. I know that they do I've been told they do a great job with character. But Chuck, he coached at Creasy, and Salazar played. Chuck Creasy coached at Clemson, and Salazar played at Clemson. But you ended up being the bad boy
Yeah.
Elaborate upon that experience a little bit.
Sure. No, so I worked for a couple summers at the Junior Tennis Center. I forget what they call it, JTCC or something like that. But like you said, it was in Maryland. They had Kudla, they had Mitchell Frank, they had Junior Ore, who were three of the premier juniors at the time in the U.S. I think all of them were probably top 20 ITF. I know Kudla was as high as maybe 6 in the world. And Junior had he had a win over former number 1 in the world ITF at the French Open, Junior French Open. So he was an incredible athlete. Mitchell Frank was he was a Leighton Hewitt. I mean, that guy was incredibly competitive, gave it everything on every point, and made a ton of balls. And they had Tiafoe there, too. At the time, I think Tiafoe was maybe 12 or 13. And Tiafoe was, I never really paid that much attention to Tiafoe, but I know that he spent a lot of time with Robin. And he was always asking Robin a lot of questions. And to this day, I would love to talk to Tiafoe and see if he got anything out of those conversations with Robin, because at that point, I know Robin had a lot of the knowledge, right, that you and I have imparted on her. And I'm like 90% sure. We'll have to find some film on this or something, or if Tiafoe happens to listen to this, we'll have to confirm. But I'm 90% sure that when he was 12, he had a reset backhand. He had a reset backswing on the backhand. And I think he had a discussion with Robin that resulted in him going high, low, high versus low, high, low, high. I'm not certain, but I'm like 90% sure that was a discussion that happened. And I'd be interested to know if that's true or not. But like you said, I went into there and I was totally green in the sense that I just said what I saw, and I didn't care who was whose coach. I was all about, I'm going to tell this kid what I think is going to give him the best chance to play world class someday. And so that meant telling Kudla that, he was inefficient on his forehand. That meant telling Mitchell Frank that he had a horizontal swing off the backhand side. And that meant telling, Junior Ore, the same things, that he had a ton of speed, but he didn't really know how to hit a forehand or backhand, and that he had to adjust from these very extreme grips that he had. And I was just doing that. And what I tell you was so great and refreshing about Chuck Creasy was that he's obviously a very accomplished tennis coach, right? He's in multiple tennis Hall of Fames. I think he won several national championships at Clemson. But he said to me, just straight up, like, you see technique better than I see technique. You've got an eye for that I don't have. And he was totally comfortable in his own skin admitting that to me. And that's why him and I really got along. And I think, Frank Salazar, not quite the same approach, right? He wasn't as open to, because Junior and Mitchell and Dennis were his students. Pretty much, like, he was kind of overseeing their development. And so for me to go in and say, hey, Dennis, your forehand, you could really do this better. He took great offense to that. And I understand that perspective. He's coming from, having worked with them for such a long time and developed that relationship, and maybe is protective over his students. But, when I took Junior down to see you, Steve, the intent was to be down there for a few weeks and then come back up to JTCC and continue to work on his game while we were there. It was never the intent to, quote unquote, steal students away from that program, which I think is what Frank Salazar was saying that I was doing. Although I don't know that he necessarily believed that. I think, from my opinion, I think he just didn't want to see me back.
No, there's so many sides, so many sides to that too, is that you ended up coming down. So we have a place where 16 players can stay. And so you got a bunkhouse. You're not paying rent in New York City, and you work, I paid you next to nothing. It wasn't, you just came in with these 2 players, and you basically did that for free. And I mean, you didn't have, you basically got room and board. You weren't even paid for that. So yeah, people don't know the whole story, but actually there's always two sides. Is that that's for a young coach to go in and we always have these kids come to be videotaped, and they'll fly in, and it's really it's like when's your next tournament? So they'll fly in on a Monday. They plan on being here for the first visit and go back to play another tournament. They're like, okay, well we're here to see you Monday through Friday, and we're going to travel, and we got a tournament. And they're coming in thinking that they have no idea what we're going to do, and we slow down and film them. History repeats itself. Chuck Creasy worked with Tom Gilly. Tom Gilly, bright guy who's studying Chinese history at the University of Chicago, decides he wants to be a tennis teacher. He comes and gets the 2-year degree that we have. And for, I think, 15 years, he ran the world-class program at Vandermeer's. But at one point, he was helping Chuck with his camp. And there was a really nice family in Tampa, the Sullivans, 3 kids who played tennis. And I worked with them when they were really young, and they all had a quote-unquote great base. But years ago, the definition of an expert was someone from out of town with a slideshow. But I was living in Tampa, so I wasn't an expert. So the mom's from South Carolina, and they went up, and they're working with Chuck. And the mom said to Chuck, or said to Tom Gilly, first of all, Chuck said about Tom Gilly what he said about you. He had told Heather Sullivan, no, Tom Gilly, he's the technician here. So then she said to Tom, you learned technique from Dennis Vandermeer. And he goes, well, no, I learned a lot of technique from Dennis Vandermeer, but I really learned technique from, again, third person, Steve Smith. And I remember Heather Sullivan coming back to Tampa and meeting with me and apologizing. She wanted to just meet with me. She goes, I want to apologize. I had no idea. Because that comes back to you being a local yokel. You're in Tampa, and you only see what you see. You come out and you see the people there for the day, and then also you only have the teenage perspective, and say your parents are new to the tennis world. But I've always been impressed with Tiafoe's stage fright. Junior Ore's still hanging in there, playing some doubles. He played well enough coming out of that experience where he went to Kalamazoo and he beat the French Open junior champion, Bjorn Frantangelo. Steve Denton brought him into Texas A&M because of what he had learned through us. And, then you got to really stay the course. Mitchell Frank did so well. I remember my son Connor had a win over Mitchell, and there's no way that Connor would have beat Mitchell in the juniors or even in college. Kudla, different story. My son Connor, he had a sitter volley to earn match point. Remember Steve Roberts was with him out in Northern Cal, and Connor lost that third set 6-love. It's amazing how the sun went down, the temperature went up, and but Kudla. I was told that those 3 were top 10 players ITF. I thought, not top 20, but regardless, they were very, very good. And if you put them together, where you had Ore's speed, Mitchell Frank's mental toughness, and Kudla, they say he never stopped hitting the backboard as a kid. He had the best strokes of the 3. But I think that he must have, those 3 certainly had to pave the way for Francis Tiafoe. That must have helped him tremendously. What other comments do you have on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think that's a great description of 3 of those guys. And what I could tell you is that Tiafoe, he was also a backboard rat. So, I remember in the summers, when we would have that lunch period where it was like, 12 to 1:30 or whatever it was. And that was really the social period, right? For the kids to have lunch and, talk and play together and, and things like that. And Tiafoe would be out on the backboard during that time, out there in the sun, just hitting more balls, and he really kind of just shadowed Kudla, wherever Kudla was, Tiafoe was. And so, that goes back to, you got to be mature beyond your years. And I think in a lot of ways, Tiafoe, he was kind of smart enough to separate from the pack and follow the folks that he knew kind of was having success and to try to emulate the way that they were doing things. And I think Kudla even today is still in the top 100. So, I think, his forehand, he hits it the same way today that he hit it 12 years ago when I saw him. And I think, if he had made some adjustments 12 years ago on that, he maybe could have got inside the top 20, for example. So, but yeah, that was a good experience. It was, one of my first right out of college, experience. And I definitely did not walk into that environment, with tact, I would say. I walked in there speaking my mind.
Well, there's some positives to that. Francis Tiafoe, what a powerful story you just shared. You mentioned the Myers-Briggs, and people put all these building blocks together that we talk about. I always talk about how he has no stage fright. I don't know him from the Man in the Moon, so I'm at 2 tournaments, and my son's in the tournament, and he's just calling me Papa Smith, like I've known him my whole life. And he's so social, so to hear that, an extrovert who's so social and so people-oriented like Francis Tiafoe, that he spent, you just got to imagine everywhere in the U.S. it's hot in the summer, that he put all those hours on the backboard. You mentioned you want to talk about Ryler to Hart. Why?
Yes, Ryler. So here's my thing on Ryler. I remember watching. Well, so I've obviously had a lot of practices with Ryler. A very successful tennis career, way more successful than I was. I remember watching Ryler play Rafael Nadal at the U.S. Open. I believe it was a night match on center court.
Correct.
And I think it was a straight sets, and Ryler was competing. And the only thing that I could think about the whole time was, Steve, that's not how you teach how to hit the forehand. And I was just looking at the backswing on the forehand side, and I'm like, that's not how he was taught how to hit the forehand. And I think in some ways, Ryler was an NCAA champion, had an incredibly successful career, and grew up around your information. But at the same time, if I'm honest, I don't think he's a great example of what you teach, of the information that you share with people. I don't know that, he's the best example of that.
Well, a few things. At that Open, I was there. Austin Krajicek won Kalamazoo, and you can invite 2 people, and I was honored that, I went along with his father. And, with Austin, he had to rebuild his game at age 7. He was off to go play the Little Mo, and the assignment was, well, go play the Little Mo, and you come back, you got to totally change your game. And so anyway, Ryler gets through the qualies. For our listeners, he went to Illinois. He won the indoors. He didn't win the NCAA individual. He was part of the team. It was freshman year when they won the team title. No, he certainly was a gamer. I go way back to, Tomas Olestead first taught him. So Olestead was a student of mine. Then he works with me for years. And then he goes to Illinois, and he's working with Tyler. He was a student of mine. So it's interesting. It was not just with me, but it was with Olestead. But it's interesting, his forehand, which he would consider a weapon. He's actually loves to compete. I've been told he's playing pickleball and doing well and playing money tournaments. But he had a problem with his shoulder. He had a regressed palm up. We were never really showing any pre and posts of Ryler. When he went to Illinois, he turned Harvard down like yourself. And, I could tell you a story with his mom, Debbie. This was a game changer. I think parents, they hear this. So Andrew Laughlin went to Notre Dame. When he was a freshman at Notre Dame, Ryler to Hart was a freshman at Jesuit. And, we're all guilty of a little white lie. Maybe not all, but 99%, 98%. I guess Roberto's never fibbed at all. So anyway, Debbie DeHart calls me up and says, Ryler can't come to practice today. And I see, he's got too much homework. And they would have never guessed that I would have been at a place called It's a little subdivision right there in Tampa. I should be able to just tell you the name of it. So anyway.
Cheval.
There you go. Bingo. Cheval. Bingo. So I go to Cheval, And they've got that nice center court, beautiful center court. I go there because I have some Japanese players, and Japanese players, they want their trophy. I've got some kids that are going home. For our listeners, the Japanese have so much respect. Been in Japan quite a few times. When you play a tournament, you don't leave the tournament until the ceremony is over, even to the point where you have to stay in a hotel. So there's going to be a trophy presentation, and you stay for that trophy presentation. Maybe that's changed to this day, but that's the way it was 20-some years ago. So,
Wow. Yeah.
so I rock up to Cheval to pick up these trophies, and it's right when kids are getting out of school. And Andrew Laughlin, he's on the court with Riley DeHart. So I walk in, and Debbie DeHart looked at me like she saw a ghost. And Andrew, again, nice player. So he goes off to, he's a top 5 player in Florida, maybe a top 10 player in the United States. He goes to Notre Dame. And a kid by the name of Nathan Zeter was playing for Tiley. And Zeter wasn't as good as Laughlin in juniors. So in the fall, they play each other. And my recollection of this is Zeter beats Andrew Laughlin. And then Andrew Laughlin is spring break. He's a freshman at Notre Dame. He's very successful, CPA. He spent some time practicing with us after he graduated from Notre Dame in Tampa, because that's where he's from. So long story short, short story long. So his freshman year at Notre Dame, he doesn't travel with the team. He's sent to work with me. And if you remember, my son Mikhail's a lefty, and Laughlin was a lefty. Laughlin's a lefty. Yep. So here's this guy, he's a freshman at Notre Dame, and he comes back to our practice, and I don't think Riley would understand that. I mean, he was so young. But Debbie, from that point forward, she goes, okay, I'm listening to you. Not that Riley ever did. Riley showed up. His mother, I mean, she did such an amazing job. She passed away, unfortunately. But there was some times where she said, he's got too much homework. He couldn't come to practice. I said, no, he has to come to practice. And for our listeners, I said, he's coming here for 45 minutes. He has to be here for 45 minutes. And he's going to skip rope as hard as he can for 15 minutes straight. And he's going to hit the backboard for 15 minutes. Yeah, Roberto knows these stories so well. So I said he's going to skip rope for 15 minutes. He's going to hit the backboard for 15 minutes, and he's going to hit serves for 15 minutes, and then he goes home. He has to do that. Yep. And of course, he's a young teenage kid. He shows up and he just wants to play sets. I go, no, you got 45 minutes here. You have no choice. This is what you're doing. And so he was in the Debbie Steve bubble, and certainly he got out of that bubble, but. When he turned Harvard down and he went to Illinois, I had taken him to Braden's, and he had a shoulder. He had a problem. He had shoulder surgery. It was just an accident waiting to happen. So, when he's playing Nadal, I was with our famous student Posey at the Open. I sat in the booth with all the 15 people that Riley could invite, and so Posey and I go out to dinner afterwards, and he said, everything you talk about, the serve, the forehand, the backhand. When he was playing basketball with you that one day or playing soccer, he was a great competitor. He worked hard. He had great passion. And, but I can remember we used to have him in practice, like we have everybody, like Roger Federer, when he hits in the warm-up, he catches the racket, he goes 2-1-2. And, Ryler thought that was very restrictive. And I remember taking him to Braden. He goes, I don't like that. And Vic goes, oh, you don't have to do it. So anyway, as soon as, Vic goes back to his room, and later we go to dinner, and I tell Vic, I said, Vic, after you told me that, I took that kid in the room, I just grilled him. I said, you're not debating Vic Braden on what you like and what you don't like. And, that whole thing at Illinois, the success of the program was basically, Tyler had spent 7 years with us. The whole thing was built on really the Braden pillar. And I can remember Bruce Burke was new, and he wrote a letter to in the recruiting process to have Ryler go to Illinois, and I remember Tyler read that. He said. He goes, have Smith correct that first. He goes, you can't send it. Rather, just sit down and go, okay, let's hash all this out. And the stories behind the stories. And one thing that he never did was, Tylee knew politically that he had Ryler there for 4 years. And someone like Rajiv Ram, who was such a great player, that, Tyler didn't know he only went one semester. And, he says now, I mean, he's number 2 doubles player in the world. He says now that if he knew how successful or how long his career would be, he would have stayed in college longer. And I'm sure Tyler would have helped him with a Braden backhand. And maybe all that speculation. So someone like Rahm, perhaps if he stayed at Illinois and they had really worked on backhands. But by the time Tyler was so successful, he was more like an NBA coach. And you got to give him credit because you're managing a lot of egos. The Tyler program that really was successful was when he was taking kids that were just sectional players and taking some of those players, and they went on and became really, really good. But by the, that recruiting class he had, the kind of like the Fab Five. But no, Austin, Austin too. I mean, Austin though, he would not know our system as well as Rob. You gotta live it. That's like yourself when you were. We can wind this thing down. When you were a teenager, a day student, coming back and forth, and you were around all those players that we trained, and just think of all the different experiences. I know this is when Ryler won the indoors. I invited you and your father, and the Jesuit school was having a party at the HCC facility. And I dug, and we had 2 other students that won that title. Robin Anderson went on and won that title afterwards. I mean, our listeners should know. You brought Robin to us, and she's number 2 in the country, and it's like we got to change her backhand grip. That's what people don't. That's what people don't get. So
she was so Western off that top hand.
Yeah. So you and your dad. I hate to say it over and over again, but the tennis business is a credibility business. Credibility doesn't mean you're believable. Credibility doesn't mean you're truthful. It just means you're believable. So you and your dad rock up, and we're celebrating Ryler winning the indoor nationals they have. And I go, well, we've had 2 other players win it. And, it's not to take anything away from them, but so, Ryler, for example, he really helped the Raven Clausen now. So Raven Clausen shows up, and Ryler, he really didn't ride over on his bicycle. That would be embellishing the story. But the Jesuit school was very, very close to the HCC facility that we trained at. So, we let Raven come in and get rid of the jet lag and get used to his surroundings. And then Ryler's only a year younger, but Ryler's in high school. And I go, well, we have a high school kid coming over today, and he's going to play it. We'll film it. And Ryler wins. But I could say this about Ryler's competitiveness. So it wasn't very much longer that we take an athlete like Clausen, and then he beats Ryler, beats him in tournament play, or even like my son,
or your own son, Connor.
It's Connor. Because Ryler's a lefty, so he'd come back to Tampa and he gets to practice out at Saddle with James Blake and this and that. But he still would come around. And so Connor played him. But, it's one of those things where Connor had nothing to lose, everything to win. Ryler had not signed up, so he had to play the qualies. So he gets in, he loses to Connor. He gets in as a lucky loser, wins the tournament. And, of course, Connor told me that's the only time he's ever really listened to me. I mean, there's a few times. There's a few times at the end.
What was your advice? What was the advice you gave him going into that match against Ryler?
Well,
I'm asking the questions now, Steve.
Yeah, that's where really comes down to it. If you know what we know, and that's where are you guys really know-it-alls? Is I know more about his game than he does.
Right.
Then it'd take me a New York minute to get together with you and go, okay, I know more about your game than you do. That's just the way it is. So Ryler's a shot maker, and you just have to play through him, and again, there's so many ins and outs. But he had an open racket face on the forehand side. He's outside in on the backhand, and you've got to attack. And
the outside in on the backhand is a great call because he couldn't hit backhands down the line.
Yeah. There's some guys on the tour. My son used to practice with a guy who, ranked very, very high, and you just know this guy's got this hole in his game. But the story I was going to tell about competitiveness, and So Ryler DeHart's taking exams along with John Posey. They're taking exams. One's a D1 player, one's a D3 player. And they show up at our place. And Liberty Secchi, who played at Vanderbilt, she plays Posey, and she just thumps him. And, of course, they're coming from indoor to outdoor as well as not having played, and, with college exams and finals. So Raven thumps, and they played tons of practice matches. Raven just thumps Ryler. But the very next day, and this is where Ryler was very, very good, he could have also been a lot better in 174 in the world if he had really zoned in on what we were teaching. And our listeners should know he lived it. He didn't have a choice. After that Andrew Laughlin experience, is that his mother made sure he was there every day. But so Posey's got his head down like an ostrich. I mean, he's got his head in the sand, and he's going, I'm so bad. And because Liberty had beaten him. And so that's how he reacted the next day. And Ryler shows up the next day, and he goes, I want to play Raven again. Like it didn't set him back at all.
But he's just ready for, let me go again.
Yeah, so he loves to compete. And I think we can end on this, where there's so many outside influences and interferences with, like who said this to him and who said that to him. And, do people really circle back and go back to the well? And do they really understand, the GreatBase? So many people they watch what we do. I think if there's one person in tennis who supports what we do, there's two people who are not. They're going to look at how we slow people down and they do mechanics, and they're going to go, no way should you train an advanced player that way. But they don't understand like what basketball players do, or shooting from the foul line, or sprinters coming out of the blocks. I mean,
golfers,
it's all there. I mean, Roberto's a soccer player. I'm a former hockey player, and the World Cup, they're still doing the same soccer drills they did when they were peewees, when they were really tiny tykes. They're doing the same warm-up drills, and the same thing in hockey. But in tennis, the word style comes into it. I mean, people ask me what would I do. I go, I fight ignorance every day. I just fight ignorance every day. I mean, 2 levels of ignorance: you don't know, and you don't know, you don't know. And then also too is that people should teach and coach, and then say, well, come back and show me who you've taught to play. Show me how your students are hitting the ball. But the things I had down here to wrap this up is that you touched upon maturity, you touched upon ego. We're right now talking about levels of understanding. You certainly touched about information. I love how Roberto says that 2 players are warming up, and he looks at one player and he just goes, no information. It's amazing, obviously Roberto's bilingual, and it's amazing where some people, they'll just say it so well in their second language. Like say Roberto will say, single strategy is the tiebreaker test. And I'm just going, you couldn't say it any better. That was just perfect. I'm going to go write that down on the bathroom wall. But let's just touch upon outside influences, interferences. I think that's where, when you're 12 years old and a 13-year-old is saying something to you, I remember, I would say that a guy by the name of Tommy Anderson was the best hockey player that I ever played with. And I remember going out for this hockey team at a prep school, and he just said, I'm younger, he's a postgraduate. He said, you have the skills to make this team. I tell people, if he didn't say that to me, I don't think it would have made the team. But not that I was a superstar by any means, but it's just amazing. The parents, a lot of times, I tell kids all the time, I should say, that their parents have wisdom. Wisdom is knowledge with time, and then kids don't have wisdom. But yeah, let's just wrap this up. It's been great to talk to you. You made a lot of key points. Roberto can add to this at the end here. But other outside influences and interferences, what do you got?
Outside influences and interferences. I think, there are a lot of thoughts that come to mind with interferences, right? Ego, being one of the main interferences. And I think that was, one of the primary interferences for me was, having relative success in the juniors in Florida and being able to win a lot of matches and attain a high ranking, and not really being able to see a need to make changes that I needed to make. But, and I will say, but then I also think about times where, hey, look, I played Raven a bunch of sets and he would just wipe the floor with me, right? Never won more than 2 or 3 games in a set. And it was very clear that he was so much better in terms of skill set. And he was a serious proponent of the system and the information that you were teaching. And I think, he was one of the first guys that I could see he was playing at a world-class level. And I remember, Steve, where I first really started to buy into the system, watching Raven volley. The two grip system, I tell you, that's one of the most bizarre things, I think, that when I first got there and you were like, hey, you're going to volley with two different grips. That was one of the hardest things to really buy into. And really, I've only started volleying with a two grip system about a year and a half ago. So I only really have started to got that down about a year and a half ago. But seeing him volley forehands and backhands, I started to see, wow, okay, like this two grip system thing, this is something. I just want to leave players that are out there that are looking to play at a world-class level, that are, maybe 10, maybe you're 10 years old, maybe you're 15, maybe you're 17, whatever. The thing that's probably the most pertinent to my story, right? The pain of regret is greater than the pain of change. I wish that I had the maturity or the foresight when I was 12, 13, 14, to make these meaningful changes that would have given me the opportunity to really achieve my potential. Because I know I was a better athlete than a lot of players that had much more successful tennis careers than I did. But at the end of the day, they moved the racket better. They moved the racket more efficiently. And I would say to anybody that's trying to play world-class tennis, to remember that the pain of change or the pain of regret is greater than the pain of change. So I would leave people with that thought.
Yeah, Roberto, go next. But one thing to add a Bradenism to that is that the pain of change is greater than the pain of losing. Ego kills.
Yeah.
But go ahead, Roberto.
Yeah. Alex, thank you very much for your time. We really enjoyed having you and all your thoughts, and really will help everybody.
Good. I'm glad. Thanks for having me, Roberto.
No.
This has been a lot of fun.
I'm gonna ask you. I can see your passion for the game. You have any projects to be coaching? And the second, the human side, how tennis or your journey help you now that you are married to be a father and a husband?
Yeah. Such good questions. Again, starting with tennis, it teaches you so much. It teaches you so much off the court in terms of, having a level of independence, being a thinker, not always a feeler, problem solving, thinking critically, taking responsibility for outcomes. I think all of that has helped me has helped shape me into being, a better father, being a better husband. I'm certainly not perfect. And Steve, by the way, I've got to work this in here. Be ready for my wife to come down there too with my son, because every time I get her out on the court, she says she wants to learn, and I give her tips, and she says, "Don't touch me. I know what I'm doing." So it's going to have to come from somebody that's not her husband.
Arthur Ashe.
So be ready for
Arthur Ashe. Never teach your spouse.
So be ready for Blaze and my wife to be down there at some point.
Very, very quickly, just tell the listeners what field you work in. I'm sure they have an interest.
What do I work in? What was the question?
Cyber protection.
So I work. I'm in defense contracting. I'm a director for business development for a company that does three primary services. So one is we focus a lot on cybersecurity. So anything computer network defense related. We also do a lot of data analytics work and a lot of software development work. So most of our clients are Department of Defense organizations. And we basically are a private company that provides these services to the federal government. And I'm basically in charge of, for our business unit, in charge of growth and sales.
Okay, just a couple of things. One, when we started the podcast, we mentioned a podcast that's very, very successful. It was voted one for 2021. And that we said, okay, we're going to interview someone who's currently not playing, currently not coaching. Maybe we'll give him the title hobby coach. But it's been fantastic to have you on. I just knew it'd be a great conversation. One thing that you and I have talked about in Charleston, South Carolina, where you're based, try to hook up with an association. Maybe you could start one and teach parents how to get on the court with their young kids, help parents and learn how to practice in the garage, how to practice in the driveway. Tennis is so expensive.
That's right.
I do think one takeaway, big, there's so many, but I love how you said the delivery system has to improve for teaching tennis.
Yeah.
And, when you mentioned that, I do know this, listeners, that Alex can keep his Princeton degree on this note, that he did go to hockey games when he was at Princeton. I always tell people if they graduate from Ivy League.
My roommate was on the hockey team.
Yeah, so good boy. There you go. But also, too, I do think, get this in, I think Penn and Columbia should be dropped from the Ivy League until they have a hockey team. But
safety schools. That's what we call them, safety schools, Steve.
Yeah, okay. So, but I do think, I think that one thing with you being able to spell cat, we could
K-A-T.
We could call up and see if we could pull some strings to strip you of that Princeton degree, because it took you too long to understand a two-grip system. But with that, when you said delivery system, let me just mention two superstars in the tennis teaching days gone by. Is Vic Braden, when he would teach the two-grip system on the volley, he would say it's just like a chest pass in basketball. Not only do you have to change your grip, your arms got to go from bent to straight. So you just take a basketball and you push both palms in very quickly. Then Dennis Vandermeer, he was so great. During part of the reason I teach tennis the way I teach tennis is I just fought a lot of stupidity over the years. Like these pre-post videos we make, or the take-home technical analysis, is you just know what the industry norms are. But Dennis, he would be in front of a group and he would turn for a backhand volley, and he would change his grip. And the next time he would turn, he wouldn't change his grip. He says, what takes more time? They take the same amount of time. No, we have so much fun just on that one point. We have a clip on our course, Tennis Intelligence Applied, and we just say, once you hear this, you may stop the course. And we had one father who stopped taking the course. Then he saw some of our students hit the ball. He started taking the course again, and tennis world's a small place. His son is the captain of the team for Chuck Creasy. But Alex.
Oh, awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alex.
Steve, Roberto, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
This is like a marathon. We're doing well, because anytime you can run a marathon under 3 hours, I mean, that's a really good time. But Alex, all the best to you.
Good for us.
All the best to you, your wife, Blaze, and days ahead. All the best to your family.
Thanks so much.
All
right, guys. Take it easy.
All right. Adios.
See ya.
Roberto. I like that. I hope our listeners like that. And again, they're marathons, but if people could just find time to, watch 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there, we're going to get to the 100 mark and reevaluate with our podcast. I do think that we need to have a note taker or some sound bites from some key points. But if someone wants to really go for a long walk, they could listen to a lot of, I thought, really good points that he made, a lot of value. What do you got, Roberto? Anything?
No, that's fine, Steve. Thanks.
You're going to go home and watch Messi? I'm going to go home and see what's going on with the NHL playoffs.
Yeah.
And but no, that was great. I just knew that he would nail it. And but I just think very, very mature guy and intelligent. Is obviously brought up really well, but he and he was around us so much. But it's just awareness, acceptance, commitment.
Yeah.
And with we got a couple student assistants that I spoke to the parents today, and the one dad said, "Well, how are we going to do it?" I go, "We're not. He has to do it. We're not going to do it." And I like the line that we're a compass. We just give directions. And I mean, I've got some positive feedback. A boy that just visited here is highly ranked in his province, and I go, he still hits the ball at shoulder level. Yeah, he's improved, and I think that the word critical came up, which is key. I think, how's it go? Be nothing. To avoid criticism, be nothing, do nothing, say nothing. And you got to be your own best critic. I think that you got to eat criticism like you eat cookies. And
No, I was impressed about his passion for the game. He's there, he looked fresh in the end.
yeah, no, he loves it. A hobby
Loves
coach, and the passion quotient is, all you got to do is go to like a Pete Sampras, go to YouTube and listen to Pete Sampras' Hall of Fame. He's a very quiet guy, but if you listen to his Hall of Fame speech, you'll find out how much passion he had. Yeah. Anyway, listeners, thanks. Number 92 is in the books. Another marathon. Oh, man. Guys, I feel sorry for you guys. I apologize. We're so bad. Oh.
Yeah, that was 3 hours for the